Hello, my lovely people, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that these stories involve real people and real tragedies. We share them not for entertainment, but to remember the victims, and to help others recognize the warning signs that might prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't hiding in dark alleys or lurking in shadowy forests. Sometimes they're living right next door, sharing the same hallways, attending the same classes, existing in plain sight while harboring unimaginable darkness. This is the story of Lauren Giddings, a brilliant young woman whose life was stolen just as she stood on the threshold of her dreams, and the neighbor whose carefully constructed facade would eventually crumble to reveal something truly horrifying. Lauren Giddings was 27 years old in the summer of 2011, and her entire life seemed to be unfolding exactly as she'd always imagined. She had just graduated from Mercer University School of Law in Macon, Georgia, joining a proud tradition of lawyers in a historic southern city, where old oak trees draped with Spanish moss lined streets that had witnessed centuries of American history. Lauren wasn't originally from Georgia. She'd grown up in Maryland, where she'd built a foundation of ambition, intelligence, and genuine warmth that would define her throughout her life. Those who knew her described someone who lit up every room she entered, someone whose laughter was infectious, and whose kindness seemed limitless. She was the kind of person who remembered small details about your life, who checked in on friends during difficult times, who made everyone around her feel seen and valued. After completing her undergraduate degree at Agnes Scott College, Lauren had set her sights on law school. It wasn't just about prestige or money for her. Lauren genuinely wanted to make a difference, to use the law as a tool for justice and positive change. When she was accepted to Mercer University's law school, she threw herself into her studies with characteristic determination. Law school is notoriously grueling. The reading load is crushing, the competition fierce, the pressure relentless. But Lauren thrived. She found her tribe among fellow students who shared late-night study sessions fueled by coffee and determination. She built friendships that sustained her through the difficult moments. And she excelled academically, proving that she had what it took to succeed in one of the most demanding professional paths anyone can choose. During her time at Mercer, Lauren lived in an apartment complex called Barrister's Hall, located on Georgia Avenue. The building was popular with law students because of its proximity to campus. It wasn't fancy, just a typical apartment complex with exterior walkways, multiple units sharing common walls and spaces. The kind of place where you'd nod to neighbors in passing and occasionally hear music or conversations through the walls. Lauren's apartment became her sanctuary. She decorated it with personal touches that reflected her personality. Photos of family and friends, mementos from her travels, and experiences, the accumulation of a life being actively lived. It was here that she studied for exams, here that she decompressed after long days, here that she felt safe and at home in a city that had initially been unfamiliar but had become her own. By June 2011, Lauren had accomplished what she'd set out to do. She'd completed law school, walked across the stage in her graduation gown, and received her diploma. All that stood between her and her official entry into the legal profession was the bar exam, scheduled for later that summer. She'd already begun preparing, setting up a study schedule, gathering materials, mentally preparing for one final push before she could truly say she'd achieved her dream. But first, there was a celebration to attend. Her sister Caitlin was getting married in Maryland, and Lauren wouldn't have missed it for the world. The wedding was everything you'd hope for such an occasion. Joyful, emotional, filled with love and laughter and hope for the future. Lauren was radiant throughout the festivities, celebrating her sister's happiness while also sharing her own excitement about what lay ahead. She told her family about her plans. After the bar exam, she was planning to move. The apartment in Macon had served its purpose, but Lauren was ready for the next chapter. She talked about her career aspirations, about the kind of law she wanted to practice, about the difference she hoped to make. Her parents and sister listened with pride, seeing in Lauren someone who had worked so hard and was finally about to reap the rewards of that dedication. On June 25, 2011, Lauren returned to Macon from her sister's wedding. She had a lot to do: unpacking, organizing her study materials for the bar exam, preparing to eventually pack up her apartment for her planned move. It was a Saturday, and the summer heat in Georgia was already building toward the oppressive humidity that defines southern summers. That evening, Lauren did what many young people do on a Saturday night. She met up with friends, enjoying one last bit of social time before she'd need to buckle down for serious bar exam preparation. They went out, had drinks, laughed and talked, and enjoyed being young and free and full of potential. Lauren was in good spirits. She was exactly where she wanted to be in life. The evening wound down, as evenings do. Friends said their goodbyes, made plans to catch up again soon, headed to their respective homes. Lauren returned to her apartment at Barrister's Hall. She climbed the stairs or walked along the exterior corridor to her unit, unlocked her door, stepped inside, and closed it behind her. She had no way of knowing that someone had been watching her. Someone who had been planning. Someone who had been waiting. Stephen McDaniel was also a recent graduate of Mercer University School of Law. He'd walked the same halls as Lauren, sat through the same classes, experienced the same pressure cooker environment that defines legal education. On paper, they were peers, colleagues, fellow travelers on the path to legal careers. But Stephen McDaniel was not like Lauren Giddings. Not in any way that mattered. McDaniel lived in the same apartment complex as Lauren Barrister's Hall. They were neighbors, which meant they'd likely passed each other countless times over the years. A nod in the hallway, a brief greeting while checking mail, the kind of casual, meaningless interactions that define apartment living. But for McDaniel, these interactions meant something very different. He'd become fixated on Lauren in a way that went far beyond neighborly awareness. He watched her. He thought about her constantly. He had at some point crossed the line from neighbor to stalker, though no one knew it yet. Those who knew McDaniel during his time at Mercer would later struggle to reconcile what they'd known of him with what he'd eventually be revealed to be. He was awkward, certain, socially uncomfortable in a way that made interactions with him feel slightly off. Though nothing you could quite put your finger on, he didn't make friends easily. He seemed isolated, separate from the social connections that sustain most people through difficult periods. But awkward isn't criminal. Socially uncomfortable isn't dangerous. Many people are introverted or struggle with social situations without harboring any darkness. Stephen McDaniel, however, was harboring something far worse than social anxiety. He developed an obsession with Lauren. At some point, and the exact timeline remains unclear, he'd begun actively stalking her, not just watching from afar, but deliberately positioning himself to observe her, to track her movements, to invade her privacy in ways she never suspected. McDaniel had something that gave him access Lauren never knew about, a master key to the apartment complex. The details of how he obtained this key remain part of the disturbing calculus of this crime. But having it meant that locked doors weren't actually locked to him. Privacy wasn't actually private. Safety was an illusion. According to what McDaniel would eventually confess, he'd been planning something terrible for some time. In June 2011, about 2 weeks before Lauren's murder, McDaniel had traveled to Pike County, Georgia, roughly 50 miles northwest of Macon. His grandfather owned land there. McDaniel surveyed that land, walking through woods, noting locations, planning something almost incomprehensible in its coldness. He was looking for places where he could scatter dismembered body parts. He was planning murder, planning how to dispose of evidence, working through the logistics of killing someone and making them disappear, and he was doing all of this while still functioning in normal society. Graduating from law school, interacting with classmates, maintaining the facade of a normal person. On the night of June 25th, 2011, while Lauren was out with friends, McDaniel was filming her apartment from outside. He'd positioned himself where he could look through her windows, his camera recording, documenting her space, perhaps waiting to see when she'd return. The premeditation was chilling. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was planned, calculated, thought through in advance. When Lauren returned home that night and eventually went to bed, she had no idea what was coming. She locked her door, as anyone would, feeling safe in her own home. But locks don't matter when someone has a key. In the early morning hours of June 26, 2011, technically Sunday morning, Stephen McDaniel used his master key to enter Lauren's apartment. He'd prepared for this. He wore a mask and gloves. He moved quietly through her space, this place where she slept and studied and lived her life. And he made his way to her bedroom. What happened next is almost too horrific to fully process. McDaniel strangled Lauren Giddings with his hands as she slept. She was in her own bed, in her own home, in the place where she should have been safest. The attack was personal and brutal. Strangulation is an intimate form of murder that requires sustained pressure, time, physical contact. Lauren fought for her life in those terrible moments, but she had no chance against an attacker who'd planned this attack and had the element of surprise. When it was over, when Lauren was dead, McDaniel left her body in her apartment and departed. But his work wasn't finished. Not even close. On Monday, June 27th, McDaniel returned to Lauren's apartment. What he did there is almost incomprehensible. He went into her bathroom and used a hacksaw to dismember her body. The bathroom where she'd gotten ready for classes and social events, where she'd performed the mundane rituals of daily life, became the scene of something grotesque beyond imagining. This wasn't a panicked attempt to hide evidence. This was methodical, calculated. McDaniel worked in that bathroom, sawing through bone and tissue, reducing a vibrant human being to parts that could be transported and hidden. The sheer coldness required to do this, the complete absence of empathy or humanity, speaks to something fundamentally broken in McDaniel's psychology. He left Lauren's torso in a trash bin outside the apartment complex, just steps from where they both lived. Her head and other body parts were taken elsewhere. Where exactly, McDaniel has never fully revealed, and they've never been found. That decision to hide parts of her body in multiple locations shows continued calculation. He was thinking about discovery, about investigation, about trying to make it difficult to identify her or piece together what had happened. For several days, Lauren's torso remained in that trash bin. People walked past it. Life at Barristers Hall continued. No one knew. When Lauren didn't respond to calls or messages, people began to worry. Her friends knew she was dedicated to her bar exam preparation, but this was different. She wasn't answering her phone. She wasn't responding to texts. For someone as social and connected as Lauren, this silence was alarming. Her family grew increasingly concerned. Lauren had just been with them for her sister's wedding. She'd been in great spirits, excited about the future. There was no reason she would suddenly cut off contact. Something was wrong. On June 30th, 2011, Lauren was officially reported missing. The Macon Police Department began investigating, and Detective Steve Gatlin took the lead. When police went to Lauren's apartment to conduct a welfare check, they found her car in the parking lot. That was concerning. If she'd left voluntarily, she likely would have taken her car. Inside her apartment, things looked mostly normal. There was no obvious sign of a struggle or disturbance. But Lauren wasn't there, and no one knew where she'd gone. The investigation kicked into high gear. Police began canvassing the area, talking to neighbors, trying to piece together when Lauren had last been seen, and what might have happened to her. They posted flyers. They reached out to her friends and family. They checked hospitals and other locations. Lauren seemed to have simply vanished. As part of their investigation, police naturally interviewed residents of Barristers Hall. One of those residents was Stephen McDaniel, and this is where the case takes one of its most bizarre and chilling turns. On the day that Lauren was officially reported missing, McDaniel agreed to be interviewed by a local news crew that was covering the story of the missing law student. He positioned himself as a concerned neighbor and fellow law school graduate, someone worried about what had happened to Lauren. The video of this interview would later become infamous. McDaniel appeared on camera, standing outside the apartment complex. Speaking with the reporter, he talked about Lauren, described her as someone he knew from law school, expressed appropriate-sounding concern about her disappearance. He was wearing a Mercer Law t-shirt, presenting himself as just another worried member of the community. But there was something off about him. His affect was flat. His words expressed concern, but his face and body language seemed disconnected from those emotions. He spoke in a monotone, with an oddly robotic quality. People who've watched this video often describe feeling an intuitive sense that something wasn't right, even before knowing the truth. During the interview, the reporter casually mentioned they'd found something near the apartment complex. McDaniel's reaction was captured on camera. His face fell. His eyes seemed to lose focus. He started to sway slightly. The reporter, not realizing what they were witnessing, continued talking, but McDaniel seemed to be somewhere else entirely. What the reporter didn't know, but what McDaniel had just realized, was that police had found Lauren's torso in that trash bin. The body had been discovered. The investigation had just shifted from a missing person case to a murder investigation. And McDaniel knew in that moment, standing in front of a camera with a microphone in his face, that everything was about to fall apart. The video shows him struggling to maintain his composure. He seems to be calculating, processing, trying to figure out what this means for him. It's a chilling glimpse into the mind of someone who'd committed an unthinkable crime, and was now watching his plans crumble in real time. When police used luminol in Lauren's apartment, the chemical that reveals traces of blood invisible to the naked eye, the bathroom lit up like someone had flipped a switch. The entire bathtub glowed under the luminol's revealing light. Blood had filled that tub almost to the rim. Approximately 2 inches from the top. The sheer volume was staggering. This was where McDaniel had dismembered Lauren's body, and despite whatever cleaning he'd attempted, the evidence remained. Detective Gatlin and his team now had a crime scene, and a victim. What they needed was concrete evidence linking a suspect to the murder. Stephen McDaniel was already on their radar. He was a neighbor. He'd been acting strangely, and there was just something about him that troubled investigators. But suspicious behavior isn't proof. On July 1st, 2011, police brought McDaniel in for questioning. What followed was one of the most unusual interrogations in recent true crime history. For 2 hours, McDaniel sat across from investigators. And for most of that time, he said virtually nothing. Not in the way that someone refusing to answer questions says nothing. He literally didn't speak. He sat motionless, staring, his face blank. When detectives asked questions, he didn't respond. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't proclaim his innocence. He didn't get angry or defensive. He simply sat there like a machine that had been powered off. Interrogators are trained to read body language, to notice signs of stress or deception, to pick up on the tells that most people unconsciously display when lying or under pressure. But McDaniel gave them almost nothing to work with. The video of this interrogation has circulated online, and people who watch it describe it as deeply unsettling. There's something inhuman about McDaniel's lack of response, his ability to simply shut down and become nearly catatonic. Psychologists who've analyzed his behavior have suggested it might be a dissociative response, or perhaps a calculated strategy to avoid saying anything incriminating. Whatever the cause, it made for a surreal and disturbing interrogation. Eventually, as the interrogation went on, McDaniel made a brief statement that was both bizarre and telling. He said something about how, if something happened to someone, the most logical suspect would be a neighbor. It was an odd thing to say, simultaneously appearing to distance himself, while also revealing that he'd been thinking about exactly this scenario. While McDaniel was being questioned, police were conducting searches. They obtained warrants and searched his apartment at Barrister's Hall. What they found there painted a picture of someone whose inner life was very different from what he projected to the world. On McDaniel's computer, investigators found videos he'd filmed of Lauren. These weren't casual videos from social gatherings or shared moments between friends. These were surveillance videos, filmed surreptitiously from outside her apartment. McDaniel had been watching her through her windows, recording her in her private space without her knowledge or consent. The videos were time-stamped to the same night he'd murdered her. He'd been stalking her right up until the moment he used his master key to enter her home and kill her. The videos proved premeditation beyond any doubt. This wasn't a spontaneous act. This wasn't a confrontation that escalated. McDaniel had been planning, watching, waiting. He'd invaded Lauren's privacy repeatedly before he invaded her home and took her life. Investigators also found a hacksaw in the apartment complex. When they tested it, they found blood evidence and McDaniel's DNA on the tool. This was almost certainly the saw he'd used to dismember Lauren's body. He'd apparently disposed of it somewhere in the complex rather than taking it with him, perhaps thinking it would be safer to hide it in plain sight among other residents' belongings. But perhaps the most bizarre piece of evidence involved condoms. Specifically condoms that had been stolen. Investigators discovered that someone had broken into an apartment in the complex and stolen condoms. When they examined the evidence, they found that McDaniel was connected to this burglary. The condoms found in his apartment were the same brand and size as those that had been stolen. Why steal condoms? The speculation was chilling. McDaniel may have been planning to use them during a sexual assault, either as part of the murder or as a separate crime. The fact that he'd stolen them, rather than simply purchasing them, suggested he was trying to avoid creating a paper trail. Another sign of premeditation and planning. In the end, there's no evidence that he'd sexually assaulted Lauren, but the stolen condoms spoke to his mindset and intentions. On August 2nd, 2011, Stephen McDaniel was formally charged with first-degree murder in the death of Lauren Giddings. The community was shocked, though, in retrospect. Many people said there had been something off about McDaniel. Teachers and classmates recalled his odd behavior, his social isolation, the vague sense of discomfort he created. But no one had imagined he was capable of something like this. The case against Stephen McDaniel was overwhelming. The physical evidence, the videos, the stolen condoms, his bizarre behavior before and after Lauren's disappearance, all of it pointed to his guilt. But prosecuting the case would take time, and the legal system moves slowly, even when guilt seems obvious. For nearly 3 years, Lauren's family waited for justice while McDaniel sat in jail. During this time, Lauren's family filed a federal lawsuit that revealed additional disturbing details about McDaniel's planning. The lawsuit detailed his trip to Pike County 2 weeks before the murder, his surveying of his grandfather's land, his search for places to dispose of body parts. The level of premeditation was extraordinary and deeply disturbing. The lawsuit also highlighted something that made Lauren's murder even more tragic. If possible, McDaniel had apparently asked Lauren out at some point, and she declined but tried to remain friendly, telling him she wanted to stay in touch. Lauren had confided to her actual friends that McDaniel made her feel uneasy, but she'd been kind in her rejection, trying not to hurt his feelings or create awkwardness since they were neighbors and classmates. That small act of kindness, trying to let someone down gently, may have been what sealed her fate. McDaniel had apparently become fixated on her, perhaps interpreting her polite friendliness as something more, or perhaps simply unable to accept rejection. For someone like McDaniel, who seemed to lack normal empathy and social understanding, Lauren's kindness might have been twisted into something entirely different in his mind. In the spring of 2014, the case finally moved toward resolution. McDaniel's trial was scheduled to begin, and prosecutors were ready to present their overwhelming evidence. But then something happened that's common in cases where the evidence is irrefutable. McDaniel agreed to plead guilty as part of a deal with prosecutors. On April 1st, 2014, Stephen McDaniel stood in court and admitted to murdering Lauren Giddings. He confessed to using the master key to enter her apartment in the early morning hours of June 26, 2011. He admitted to strangling her in her bedroom while wearing a mask and gloves. He acknowledged dismembering her body in her bathroom the following day. What he didn't do was tell anyone where he'd hidden her head and other body parts. To this day, despite extensive searches, those remains have never been recovered. Lauren's family has had to live with the knowledge that their daughter, their sister, isn't fully laid to rest. Parts of her are somewhere out there, hidden by a killer who won't reveal their location even after confessing to the murder. McDaniel was sentenced to life in prison. He'll be eligible for parole in 2041, when he'll be in his 50s. Whether he'll ever be granted parole is another question entirely. The nature of his crime, the premeditation involved, the dismemberment, and his refusal to reveal where he hid Lauren's remains, all of this will weigh heavily against him when and if he faces a parole board. Lauren's family has continued to search for her remains. They've organized searches in Pike County, believing that the land McDaniel surveyed before the murder might hold answers. They've reached out to investigators, followed up on tips, done everything possible to bring old Lauren home. It's a heartbreaking extension of their grief. This inability to fully say goodbye. The case has become well known in true crime circles, particularly because of those surreal video moments. McDaniel's news interview where he learns about the body's discovery is nearly catatonic interrogation. These videos have been analyzed endlessly by people trying to understand what makes someone capable of such a crime. But videos and analysis don't really answer the deeper questions about how someone can completely lack empathy, can plan a murder in such detail, can dismember a human being and then act as if nothing happened. It's easy, when discussing true crime, to become focused on the perpetrator, their psychology, their motives, their bizarre behavior. But the person who deserves to be remembered is Lauren Giddings. Lauren was 27 years old when she died. She'd accomplished so much already, earning her undergraduate degree, completing law school, building friendships and connections that enriched her life and the lives of those around her. She was funny, intelligent, kind, and driven. She had plans for her future, dreams she wanted to pursue, contributions she wanted to make to the world. Her family and friends described someone who was genuinely good. Not perfect. No one is. But someone whose default setting was kindness. She checked in on people. She celebrated her friends' successes. She was present in the lives of those she cared about. In a world that can often feel harsh and disconnected, Lauren was someone who created warmth and connection wherever she went. She'd worked so hard to get to where she was. Law school demands incredible dedication. It requires long hours, sustained focus, the ability to master complex material and think analytically about problems that often have no clear right answer. Lauren had done all of that. She'd graduated. She was preparing for the bar exam. She was right there, right on the cusp of beginning the career she'd dreamed about. And then Stephen McDaniel took all of that away. He took her future, her potential, all the lives she might have touched as a lawyer, an advocate. He took her from her family, who'll never see her walk into a room again, never hear her laugh, never celebrate holidays or milestones with her. He took her from her friends, who lost someone who made their lives better simply by being in them. What makes Lauren's murder even more senseless is that there was no rational motive. She hadn't done anything to McDaniel. She'd been polite to him when he'd asked her out, even though he made her uncomfortable. She'd simply existed in the same apartment complex, gone about her life, pursued her dreams for McDaniel. That was apparently enough. His obsession with her, his inability to process rejection or connect with others in healthy ways, his fundamental lack of empathy. All of it culminated in a decision to kill someone who'd never harmed him. Lauren's family has worked to keep her memory alive. They've spoken publicly about her, sharing stories that paint a picture of who she really was beyond the victim of a terrible crime. They've advocated for other victims, turned their grief into purpose. It doesn't make the loss any easier, but it ensures that Lauren is remembered as a person, not just a case file. 10 years after her death, in 2021, her family gathered to remember her. They shared memories, looked at photos, celebrated the time they'd had with her while acknowledging the time they'd lost. They talked about what she would have been doing if she'd lived, where her career might have taken her, whether she'd have married and had children, what causes she might have championed. These are the thoughts that haunt families of murder victims. The what-ifs, the might-have-beens, the alternate timeline where their loved one simply came home safely that night and continued living their life. For Lauren's family, these thoughts are compounded by the knowledge that they still don't have all of her. That somewhere out there are remains that should be laid to rest, but instead are hidden in a location only her killer knows. The murder of Lauren Giddings is a reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself. Stephen McDaniel didn't look like a monster. He was a law student, a neighbor, someone who blended into the background of everyday life. He passed people in hallways, sat through classes, participated in the mundane rituals that define normal existence. And all the while, he was watching, planning, nurturing an obsession that would ultimately cost Lauren her life. For those of us who live in apartment complexes, who have neighbors we know only casually, who trust that locked doors and social conventions will keep us safe, this case is particularly chilling. Lauren did nothing wrong. She locked her doors. She was polite, but maintained boundaries. She was careful without being paranoid. And none of it mattered, because her neighbor had a master key and had decided she would die. The case also raises questions about how we identify and intervene with people like McDaniel before they act on violent impulses. It was awkward, yes, and socially isolated, but many people fit that description without ever harming anyone. What makes someone cross the line from awkward to dangerous? How do we protect potential victims without unfairly stigmatizing people who are simply introverted or socially anxious? These questions don't have easy answers. Mental health professionals, law enforcement, and researchers continue to study what drives someone to commit such calculated violence. But for every profile developed, for every warning sign identified, there are people who fit those patterns but never hurt anyone, and people who hurt others despite showing no obvious warning signs. What we can do is remember Lauren Giddings not as a victim whose life was defined by her death, but as a vibrant young woman who lived fully in the time she had. We can honor her memory by being kind to others, by checking in on friends, by pursuing our dreams with the same determination she showed. We can insist on justice for victims even when convictions don't bring full closure. And we can continue to grapple with the uncomfortable questions her murder raises about safety, about how we identify danger, about how we protect each other. Stephen McDaniel sits in prison, and there he'll likely remain for the rest of his life. He's become infamous for those bizarre videos, for his strange behavior, for the calculated nature of his crime. But he's not who this story should be about. This story should be about Lauren, about her laughter and her ambition, about her kindness and her intelligence, about everything she was and everything she might have become. This story should be about a family that lost someone irreplaceable, about friends who still miss her presence in their lives, about a community that was shattered by a crime that never should have happened. Lauren Giddings should be practicing law right now. She should be arguing cases, advocating for clients, making the kind of difference she'd always dreamed of making. She should be celebrating birthdays and holidays with her family, creating new memories, continuing the story of her life. Instead, her story ends on June 26, 2011, in an apartment in Macon, Georgia, at the hands of someone who saw her not as a human being with hopes and dreams and people who loved her, but as an object of obsession. That's the tragedy of this case. Not just that Lauren died, but that she died for no reason that makes any sense to people with functioning empathy and conscience. She died because someone who lived near her decided she would die. That's it. That's the whole senseless explanation. So as we close this story, let's think about Lauren Giddings, not as a victim, but as a person. Let's remember that true crime isn't entertainment. It's a record of real tragedies that devastated real families and communities. And let's hold in our minds the image of Lauren as she should be remembered. Vibrant, intelligent, kind, full of potential, and taken from this world far too soon by someone who had no right to make that decision. Her family still searches for her remains. They still hope that someday they'll be able to bring all of Lauren home and lay her to rest completely. Until then, they remember her as she was. Not as a case file or a headline, but as Lauren, beloved daughter and sister friend, and a young woman who deserved so much more than the few short years she was given. The murder of Lauren Giddings reminds us that evil can wear an ordinary face, that monsters don't always announce themselves. But more importantly, it reminds us to honor the lives that are taken too soon, to remember the person behind the tragedy, and to never forget that every victim of violence was someone's whole world. Rest in peace, Lauren Giddings. May your memory be a blessing to all who knew and loved you. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Some stories hide in plain sight, wrapped in normalcy until the moment everything unravels. This is one of those stories. It happened in rural Missouri, in a place where neighbors knew each other, where life moved at the pace of seasons changing. But beneath the surface of an ordinary marriage, something dark was taking shape. Tonight we're going to talk about Ben Renick. Not just how he died, but who he was, and how the people closest to him became the architects of his end. Ben Renick wasn't your typical Missouri farmer. Growing up in Montgomery County, he discovered something most people found unsettling, even frightening. He loved snakes, not just as pets, but as creatures worthy of respect, study, and yes, even breeding. While other kids his age were playing video games or tinkering with cars, Ben was learning about genetics, studying color morphs, understanding breeding patterns. He had a gift. By his early 20s, he turned that gift into something remarkable. Renick Reptiles wasn't just a hobby operation. Ben converted a barn on his family farm into his business. creating what would become one of the most respected snake breeding operations in the world. He was a pioneer in the industry, well known in the snake breeding community worldwide. Think about that for a moment. In rural Missouri, this young man had built an international reputation. People from across the globe knew his name. They sought out his pythons, his anacondas, the rare color morphs he'd spent years perfecting. Some snakes sold for thousands, even tens of thousands of dollars. He wasn't just breeding snakes. He was creating living art. The barn itself was a temperature-controlled sanctuary. Rows upon rows of specialized enclosures, each one home to serpents of extraordinary value. Ball pythons in colors that seemed impossible. Albino piebald combinations that looked like they'd been painted by hand. Anacondas massive and powerful, their scales glistening under carefully calibrated lights. By early 2017, Ben had negotiated a deal to sell snakes to NHL goalie Robin Lehner for $1.2 million, with payments of $200,000 per quarter throughout the year. The business was thriving. Ben was 29 years old, and at the peak of his success. From the outside, his life looked perfect. Lindley didn't come from the world of reptiles. She was more conventional in her interests, more focused on the kind of business that dealt with people rather than cold-blooded creatures. She'd gone to massage school, learned the trade, and had ambitions of her own. When she met Ben, she found someone successful, someone building something real. They married in 2014, and Lindy joined him in running the snake operation. She wasn't as passionate about the reptiles as Ben was. Few people were, but she helped with the business side of things. By 2017, with one successful business under their belts, Lindy wanted to try her hand at running her own. Ben supported her. In 2016, she opened a spa. It was her space, her vision, separate from the snakes and the farm and everything that was so uniquely Ben's world. They had a child together. On paper, they were building a life. But marriages are complex things. What people see from outside rarely matches what happens behind closed doors. The spa became more than just Lindley's business. It became her refuge, her separate world. She hired a woman named Ashley Shaw to work there. The two became closer than employer and employee, more like confidants who shared secrets. And Lindley had secrets. There was Michael Humphrey, an ex-boyfriend from her past. After her marriage, after her child, after everything she'd built with Ben, she maintained a connection with Michael. Maybe at first it was innocent, just old friends keeping in touch. But somewhere along the way, the boundaries blurred. Michael Humphrey had an affair with Lino. He became part of her shadow life, the one that existed parallel to her marriage. And in that shadow life, something dangerous began to grow. June 8, 2017, started like any other day in Montgomery County. The sun rose over farmland, over quiet roads where everyone knew everyone. Ben went to work at the snake facility, doing what he did every day, feeding, monitoring, caring for the creatures that represented his life's work and his livelihood. Lindley, according to what she would later tell investigators, was at her spa. But that day, someone made a decision, and perhaps the decision had been made weeks before, months before, and June 8 was simply the day it would be carried out. Around noon, Lindy received a call reporting that her husband had been found. When police arrived at the snake facility, they encountered a scene that seemed to tell a story at first glance. Ben Renick was found laying in a pool of blood inside his Missouri snake breeding facility, surrounded by his beloved snakes, face down, clearly dead. Investigators initially suspected one of his prized serpents had killed him. It wasn't an unreasonable assumption. Ben worked with dangerous animals. Anacondas can crush a human body. Some of the other species, while not venomous, could still inflict serious damage. Maybe there had been an accident, a moment of carelessness, a snake reacting defensively. But trained investigators don't rely on assumptions. They look closer, they examine, and when they examined Ben's body more carefully, the truth revealed itself in a way that no snake could have caused. The coroner determined Ben Renick was shot 6 times from behind. Other sources say he was shot 8 times in the back, once at close range. Either way, the message was clear and brutal. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a snake attack. This was murder. Someone had walked into that barn, pointed a gun at Ben's back, and pulled the trigger, then pulled it again, and again, and again, even after he fell, even after he was clearly dying or already dead. They made sure the final shot was to the back of his head. This wasn't a crime of passion, a split-second decision made in anger. This was execution, deliberate, planned, cold. When someone is murdered, investigators start with a simple question: who benefits? In Ben's case, that question had clear answers. Renick was the sole beneficiary of a life insurance policy for her husband worth $1 million. There was also the ongoing deal with Rob and Linner for $1.2 million for the snake business. Ben's father had died by suicide soon after his mother's death, leaving the family farm in Ben's name. Between the life insurance, the sale of the snakes, and the family farm that she would inherit, Lenny stood to gain millions from the death of her husband. But financial motive alone doesn't make someone a murderer. Investigators needed evidence. They needed to understand what had really happened, and they needed someone to talk. For months, the case seemed stalled. Lenny played the grieving widow. She attended memorials. She spoke to reporters about her loss. She maintained her innocence, her shock, her devastation. Behind the scenes, though, investigators were building a case. They were talking to people. They were following leads. They were patient, and patience in murder investigations often pays off. The truth, when it finally emerged, was more complex than a simple murder. This wasn't one person acting alone in a moment of rage. Prosecutor Kelly King said Renick tried to kill Benjamin Renick twice. Twice. Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't even the first attempt. Ashley Shaw and Michael Humphrey helped Renick with the plans to kill her husband. The woman from the spa, the ex-boyfriend, they became co-conspirators in a plot that would stretch over time. That would involve multiple attempts, multiple conversations, a web of lies and planning. The first attempt, according to testimony that would later emerge in court, involved poison. It failed. Ben didn't die. Maybe he got sick and recovered. Maybe the dose wasn't right. Maybe luck intervened. But Lindy, according to prosecutors, didn't give up. She tried again. On June 8th, Renick and Humphrey went to the snake farm. What happened next depends on whose story you believe. And that's where this case gets truly interesting. Because when it came time for trial, when everyone's secrets were laid bare, the stories didn't match. According to prosecutors and testimony from Ashley Shaw and Michael Humphrey, Lindy was the one who pulled the trigger. She was the shooter. She was the one who stood behind her husband and ended his life. But Lindy told a different story. On January 16, 2020, cops made their moves. Renick and Michael Humphrey were arrested and charged with the murder of Ben Renick. Nearly 3 years after Ben's death, the case finally moved toward justice. Michael Humphrey went to trial first. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. But there was a twist. He agreed to testify against Lindy in exchange for a reduced sentence. When Lindy's trial began in December 2021, the courtroom became a stage for competing versions of the truth. Renick testified that Humphrey drove her back to her spa, where Shaw washed her off in the shower. Shaw testified that she washed blood off of Renick. And think about that detail. Blood on Lindy's body, washed away in the shower at the spa. Whether she was the shooter or merely present, she was involved. She had her husband's blood on her skin. Lindy's defense attorney acknowledged Renick was with Humphrey on the night of the killing, but said she was not present when her husband was shot. The defense claimed that on June 8, 2017, Renick and Humphrey went to the snake farm to talk to Ben about divorcing his wife. He said Lindy heard several shots as she was taking out the trash. So, in Lindy's version of events, she went to the farm. Yes. She brought Michael. Yes. But she was just taking out the trash. Innocent incidental when Michael suddenly and without her knowledge murdered her husband. But Humphrey and Shaw told the jury that was a lie. When Lindy left the spa after being washed, she said she didn't think her husband was dead, only that something bad had happened. The jury had to decide, was Lindy a grieving wife, caught in a terrible situation, Or was she a calculating woman who orchestrated her husband's murder and then tried to pin it on her accomplices when the investigation closed in? Lindley Renick was convicted of second-degree murder. Not first degree, which would have required proof of premeditation and planning. Second degree, which acknowledges the intentional killing, but perhaps suggests the jury had some doubt about the full extent of her planning or involvement. She received a sentence of 16 years. Michael Humphrey got life, though with the possibility of reduction for his testimony. Ashley Shaw, who cooperated with prosecutors, wasn't charged. So what really happened? Even with the convictions, some questions linger. Did Lindley pull the trigger herself, or did she stand by while Michael did it? Were both of them involved in the physical act, or was one the shooter and one the accomplice? It was alleged that Lindley feared losing custody of her children if she and her husband were to divorce. Maybe that was part of her motivation. Maybe the money was the primary driver. Maybe it was a combination: the farm, the insurance, the business, the fear of losing everything in a divorce. Or maybe, as sometimes happens in marriages that turn toxic, she simply wanted him gone. The case fascinated people. Ben Renick was a rock star of the reptile world, and his murder had elements that seemed almost fictional. Exotic animals, $1 million business, a love triangle, poison, multiple murder attempts, a widow who may or may not have been a killer. When arrests were made, loved ones and friends of Lindley never saw it coming. Those who knew her expressed disbelief. To them, she was the grieving widow, the mother, the businesswoman. The idea that she could have orchestrated something so brutal seemed impossible. But that's often how these stories go. The people who commit the worst acts are rarely the ones who look like monsters. They're the neighbors, the spouses, the people who smile and wave and seem perfectly normal. Ben's brother Sam inherited what was left of the snake business. The breeding operation that Ben had built from nothing, that had become internationally recognized, had to continue without him. The snakes didn't care about murder or trials or justice. They needed to be fed, maintained, cared for. Life, in its cold-blooded way, went on. Robin Lehner, the NHL goalie who'd made that $1.2 million deal with Ben, found himself tangled in the aftermath. Lehner had made one payment of $200,000 in February 2017, before Ben's death. The remaining payments, the transfer of the business, all of that became complicated by the murder, by the legal proceedings, by questions of who now owned what. Cases like this make us ask uncomfortable questions about marriage, about money, about what people are capable of when they want something badly enough. Prosecutors alleged that Lennon conspired with a friend and ex-boyfriend to murder her husband in 2017. If true, it means she didn't just snap one day. She planned. She recruited help. She made multiple attempts, and when her husband lay dead in a pool of blood, she washed that blood away and tried to pretend she knew nothing. Was it the $1 million life insurance? The valuable farm? The business worth millions? Or was it simpler than that? A woman who wanted a different life and saw her husband as an obstacle rather than a partner. Ben Renick spent his short life building something remarkable. He turned a barn into an internationally recognized breeding facility. He mastered genetics and created living works of art in scales and muscle. He was 29 years old, at the height of his success, with years of accomplishment still ahead of him. Someone decided he shouldn't have those years. He was shot in the back several times, and then ultimately shot in the back of the head. He never saw it coming. In a place where he felt safe, surrounded by the creatures he loved, he was murdered. The snakes, of course, had nothing to do with it. The initial assumption that something in that barn had killed him was wrong. The danger didn't come from the pythons or the anacondas. It came from something far more common and far more human. Greed or desire, or the toxic end of a relationship gone wrong. The murder of Ben Renick is still shocking. Even years later, it started with a farm full of exotic animals, and ended with a man betrayed by someone he trusted most. That betrayal is perhaps the cruelest element of the whole story. Ben died because someone close to him wanted him dead. Whether Lindley pulled the trigger or orchestrated it from a step removed, she was part of the plot. The woman who'd married him, who'd had a child with him, who'd built businesses alongside him. She became part of his ending. Michael Humphrey, who confessed to helping with Ben's murder, will spend much of his life in prison, and Lindley Renick will spend 16 years behind bars, though she'll be eligible for parole eventually. Ashley Shaw, who washed blood from Lindley's body, avoided charges by cooperating with investigators. Justice, such as it is, has been served, but Ben remains dead. His family remains without him. The snake breeding operation continues without its founder. And somewhere in Missouri, a barn that was once a place of passion and business, and life is now forever marked by what happened there. In true crime, we often look for lessons, for warnings, for ways to make sense of senseless violence. Maybe the lesson here is simple. The people closest to us have the greatest power to hurt us. Trust is a precious thing, easily given but impossible to restore once broken. And when someone decides that another person's life is worth less than money or freedom or a fresh start, the consequences echo far beyond the single act of violence. Ben Renick loved snakes. He understood them. He knew they could be dangerous if mishandled. But he also knew they were predictable. They acted on instinct, on hunger, on their nature. They didn't lie. They didn't conspire. They didn't pretend to love you while planning your death. In the end, it wasn't a snake that killed him. It was something far more human and far more cruel. Rest easy, Ben Renick. Your story has been told. Please, if you're still awake, drop a candle. I want to see who's still with me. Also, don't forget to tell me where you're listening from, the time in your corner of the world, and maybe share one thing you've learned from tonight's stories. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. In the quiet city of Vancouver, Washington, where the Columbia River winds its way between Oregon and Washington state, a tragedy unfolded in March 2023 that would shake a community to its core. This is the story of Mâché Melendez, a 27-year-old mother and her 7-year-old daughter, Leila Stewart. 2 lives cut short by the very person who should have protected them. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't strangers lurking in shadows. Sometimes they're people we know, people we've loved, people we've trusted. This is one of those stories. Mâché Melendez, though some knew her as Carmen, was like so many young mothers trying to build a life for themselves and their children. At 27, she had already weathered storms that would have broken others. She had a daughter, Leila, a bright 7-year-old with her whole life ahead of her. In photographs, you can see the bond between them, a mother and daughter navigating the world together. Vancouver, Washington sits just across the river from Portland, Oregon. It's a place where people know their neighbors, where community still means something. The kind of place where you think you're safe, where you think you can start over when life gets hard. Mâché was trying to do exactly that, start over. But starting over isn't always simple when your past refuses to let you go. Mâché had been in a relationship with a man named Kirkland Warren. Like many relationships, it had probably started with promise, with hope, with all the things we tell ourselves about love and second chances. But somewhere along the way, that relationship had turned dark. Somewhere along the way, love had become control, and control had become danger. By late 2022, Mâché knew she needed to get out. She knew she needed to protect herself and her daughter. But knowing you need to leave and being able to leave safely are 2 very different things. December 2022. The holiday season when most people are thinking about family gatherings and new beginnings. For Mâché Melendez, December brought terror. She went to the Vancouver Police Department with a story that should have sent chills down anyone's spine. Her ex-boyfriend Kirkland Warren had assaulted her with a firearm. He had threatened to kill her. And in an act that seemed ripped from a nightmare, he had fired shots at her home from a moving vehicle, what police would call a drive-by shooting. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being in your home, the one place you should feel safe, and hearing gunshots. Imagine knowing that someone you once cared about now wanted you dead. Mâché did what she was supposed to do. She reported it. She sought protection. The system was supposed to keep her safe. What Mâché didn't know, what would later become a crucial detail in understanding this tragedy, was that Kirkland Warren was already on pre-trial release for separate charges out of Arkansas. He was already in the system, already considered a potential threat, already supposed to be monitored. The wheels of justice began to turn, but they turned slowly. Too slowly. On March 6, 2023, Warren appeared in district court regarding the citation from the December incident. Vancouver Police Sergeant Deb Libby, the officer who had authored the probable cause affidavit, made a specific request to the court. She asked that if Warren were released, he should be required to wear a GPS monitor and be subject to higher bail. She understood the danger. She had seen cases like this before. She knew what could happen. Judge Kristen Parcher set bail at $10,000 and issued conditions of release. There was already a court order in place, prohibiting Warren from contacting Melendez. On paper, everything looked secure. The system had responded. Protections were in place. But court orders are just pieces of paper. GPS monitors can be removed, and bail for some people is just a price to pay for freedom. Warren posted bail. He was released. And the clock began ticking toward tragedy. March 12, 2023 began like any other day in Vancouver, Washington. Spring was beginning to arrive in the Pacific Northwest, bringing with it the promise of longer days and warming temperatures. But for Mâché Melendez and her daughter, Leila, this day would be their last. When someone goes missing, there's usually a moment when people realize something is wrong. A missed appointment, an unanswered phone call, a car parked in an unusual place. For Mâché and Leila, that moment came when they simply didn't show up where they were expected to be. On March 12, family and friends reported them missing. Imagine the rising panic calls going straight to voicemail, text messages turning blue but never showing as red, knocking on a door that no one answers. The kind of silence that makes your stomach drop because you know somewhere deep down that something is terribly wrong. The Vancouver Police Department began their investigation immediately. In missing persons cases, the first 48 hours are critical. The longer someone is missing, the less likely they are to be found alive. Detectives worked around the clock canvassing the neighborhood, interviewing friends and family, checking surveillance cameras, doing everything they could to find Mâché and Leila. But March 12 became March 13, and then March 14, and then March 15. Days passed with no sign of the mother and daughter. No activity on Mâché's phone, no credit card transactions, no sightings. It was as if they had simply vanished. Except people don't simply vanish. Not really. Someone always knows something. And in this case, investigators had a strong suspicion about who that someone was. Kirkland Warren, the ex-boyfriend with a history of violence, the man who had shot at Mâché's home, the man who was supposed to be staying away from her but who had a way of ignoring court orders when it suited him. Warren was quickly named as a person of interest in their disappearance. Detectives wanted to talk to him, to find out what he knew, to understand his movements on March 12 and 13. But being a person of interest isn't the same as being a suspect. And being a suspect isn't the same as being charged. The law requires evidence, proof, something concrete. And so the search continued, expanding outward from Vancouver into the surrounding areas. The Columbia River Gorge stretches east from Vancouver, a landscape of dramatic cliffs and dense forests, of winding roads and isolated areas where someone could hide almost anything. March 22, 2023. 10 days after Mâché and Leila were reported missing. 10 days of hoping against hope that somehow they were alive, that somehow this story would have a different ending. But this story was always going to end in a rural area east of Washington, a small city about 20 miles east of Vancouver. The landscape there is beautiful in that way that the Pacific Northwest is beautiful. Towering evergreens, rolling hills, the kind of place where nature still feels wild and untamed. It's also the kind of place where bodies can be hidden. Authorities found them together, mother and daughter, in an isolated area where no one had any reason to be. The Clark County Medical Examiner's Office would later determine the cause of death for both Mâché Melendez and 7-year-old Leila Stewart. Gunshot wounds to the head. Think about that for a moment. A 7-year-old child, shot in the head. Whatever else this story is about, domestic violence, systemic failure, the dangers of ignoring warning signs. It's also about the murder of a child who had no way to protect herself, no way to understand why the adult world had become so dangerous. The investigation shifted from a missing persons case to a double homicide, and Kirkland Warren, the person of interest, became the prime suspect. On April 3, 2023, Kirkland Warren made his first appearance in Clark County Superior Court. The charges were staggering: 2 counts of first-degree aggravated murder. In Washington state, first-degree aggravated murder is the most serious crime on the books, reserved for murders that involve specific aggravating factors. In Warren's case, those aggravating factors were clear. There was a court order prohibiting him from contacting Melendez. There was a documented history of violence. And there was the victim, Leila Stewart, a child making one of the murders an aggravated charge under the law. Warren pleaded not guilty. It's a standard move in the legal system, a way of putting the burden of proof on the prosecution, of saying make your case. But as the investigation continued, that case began to build. On May 9th, 2023, additional charges were filed. 2 counts of violating a protection order, 1 count of tampering with a witness, 1 count of second-degree unlawful possession of a firearm. These charges were tied to the drive-by shooting case from December 2022, the incident that had first brought Warren into the criminal justice system. Then in October 2023, 7 months after the bodies were discovered, prosecutors added another charge, one that made an already horrific case even darker: first-degree rape of a child. The allegation involved Leila Stewart. It's difficult to write those words. It's difficult to think about what that 7-year-old girl must have experienced, not just in her final moments, but potentially for who knows how long before that. The monsters in our stories are often just that. Stories, fiction, things we can close the book on and walk away from. But real monsters don't live in fairy tales. They live in our neighborhoods. They walk into courtrooms in handcuffs and answer to judges and lawyers. On March 26, 2023, hundreds of people gathered in Vancouver to mourn and honor Mâché Melendez and Leila Stewart. Vigils like these are common after tragedies, a way for communities to process grief, to come together, to say that these lives mattered. But this vigil was different. There was grief, yes, overwhelming, devastating grief for a mother and daughter whose lives had been stolen. But there was also anger. Anger at a system that had failed to protect them. Anger at the fact that Kirkland Warren had been free to commit murder, despite all the warning signs, despite all the reports, despite all the protections that were supposed to be in place. People held candles. They shared memories. They cried. And they asked the question that always comes up in cases like these. How did this happen? How did we let this happen? The answer, of course, is complicated. Domestic violence cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute. Victims often recant their statements, whether out of fear or hope that their abuser will change. The burden of proof is high. Bail systems are designed to balance public safety with the presumption of innocence. And sometimes, even when everyone does everything right, terrible things still happen. But in this case, there were signs that everyone hadn't done everything right. There were questions about why Warren was released on bail, despite his history. Questions about whether the GPS monitoring that Sergeant Libby had requested was actually implemented. Questions about whether a system designed to protect victims of domestic violence had instead become a system that enabled their deaths. Those questions would eventually lead to a lawsuit. The family of Mâché Melendez and Leila Stewart filed suit against Clark County, alleging that the county had negligently released Warren on bail before the murders. The lawsuit claimed that Warren murdered Melendez and Stewart while out on bail, despite the fact that he was already on pre-trial release for charges out of Arkansas, despite the fact that there was a documented history of violence, despite the fact that a police sergeant had specifically asked for higher bail and GPS monitoring. It's the kind of lawsuit that asks us to examine the systems we've put in place to protect people and to question whether those systems are actually working. After the initial arraignment, the case moved through the legal system at the pace these things always move. Slowly, methodically, with continuances and motions and hearings that the public rarely hears about. A trial was initially scheduled for June 2023, then pushed back. In the world of criminal justice, delays are common. Defense attorneys need time to review evidence, to prepare their case, to investigate alternative theories. Prosecutors need time to organize their evidence, to prepare witnesses, to build a narrative that will convince 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt. By August 2024, 18 months after the murders, the case was finally ready to go to trial. The trial date was set for September 9th, 2024. For the family and friends of Mâché and Leila, it must have felt like an eternity. 18 months of waiting, of wondering whether justice would be served, of reliving the worst day of their lives over and over again through court documents and legal proceedings. But then, just days before the trial was set to begin, something unexpected happened. On September 5, 2024, Kirkland Warren changed his plea. Instead of going to trial and forcing prosecutors to present their case, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in the death of Mâché Melendez, and aggravated first-degree murder in the death of Leila Stewart. Why would someone change their plea at the last minute? Sometimes it's a strategic decision. a way to avoid the death penalty or to gain some control over sentencing. Sometimes it's because the evidence is so overwhelming that going to trial would be pointless. Sometimes it's because a defendant finally accepts what they've done and decides to spare the victims' families the trauma of a trial. We may never know Warren's true motivation, but along with the murder pleas, he also entered what's called an Alford plea to first-degree child molestation. An Alford plea is a peculiar legal mechanism that allows a defendant to maintain their innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution has enough evidence to convict them. It's a way of saying I'm not admitting I did this, but I recognize that a jury would probably find me guilty. The Alford plea was for sexually assaulting Leila Stewart. October 8, 2024, nearly 19 months after Mâché and Leila were murdered, Kirkland Warren appeared in Clark County Superior Court for sentencing. Sentencing hearings in murder cases are often emotional affairs. They're the one time when victims' families get to speak directly to the defendant, to tell them about the pain they've caused, to humanize the people who were killed. These statements are called victim impact statements, and they're some of the most powerful moments in the entire criminal justice process. We can only imagine what was said that day. The grandmother who would never see her granddaughter grow up. The siblings who lost a sister. The friends who lost someone they loved. The community members who came to bear witness. And through it all, Kirkland Warren sat there. The man who had taken 2 lives. The man who had destroyed a family. The man who had proven that court orders and bail conditions and protection orders are meaningless if someone is determined enough to ignore them. Judge Darvin Zimmerman delivered the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole for the aggravated first-degree murder of Leila Stewart, plus additional time for the murder of Mâché Melendez and the child molestation charge. Life in prison, no parole, no second chances, no possibility of ever walking free again. For some, this brings a sense of justice, a feeling that the punishment fits the crime. For others, no sentence could ever be enough, because no sentence can bring back a 27-year-old mother and her 7-year-old daughter. The story of Mâché Melendez and Leila Stewart doesn't end with the sentencing. It continues in the lives of the people they left behind, in the changes that their deaths might inspire in how we handle domestic violence cases, in the questions that still linger about how this tragedy could have been prevented. The lawsuit against Clark County continues to work its way through the civil court system. Win or lose, it represents something important. An attempt to hold institutions accountable, to force a reckoning with the systemic failures that allowed Kirkland Warren to be free when he should have been behind bars. Domestic violence is a pattern. It escalates. It doesn't get better on its own. And when someone threatens to kill you, when someone shoots at your house, when someone assaults you with a firearm, those aren't just red flags. They're flashing neon signs that say this person is capable of murder. Mâché Melendez saw those signs. She reported them. She tried to get protection. She did everything right, and she was still murdered. Along with her young daughter. That's the part that's hardest to accept. That someone can do everything they're supposed to do. Can trust in the system, can believe that law enforcement and the courts will keep them safe, and still end up dead in a rural area east of Washington with a bullet in their head. In the aftermath of tragedies like this, there's often a tendency to focus on the perpetrator, to analyze their motives, to dig into their background, to try to understand how someone becomes capable of such violence. And while that analysis has its place, it can sometimes overshadow the people who were actually harmed. So let's remember Mâché Melendez, not as a victim, but as a person, a 27-year-old woman with hopes and dreams, and plans for the future, a mother who loved her daughter. Someone who laughed and cried and got angry and felt joy. Someone who was trying to build a better life. Who was trying to escape a dangerous situation. Who deserved to live to see 30 and 40 and 50. And let's remember Leila Stewart, 7 years old. A child who should have been worried about homework and playground games and what to be for Halloween. A child who should have had decades ahead of her. Who should have grown up to be whoever she wanted to be. A child who was failed by the very adults who should have protected her. Their names were Mâché Melendez and Leila Stewart. They lived in Vancouver, Washington. They were murdered in March 2023 by someone who had been given every opportunity to hurt them because the system that was supposed to protect them didn't work. As we close this story, we're left with the questions that always linger after tragedies like this. How many other Mâché Melendez are out there right now? How many women have restraining orders that exist only on paper? How many people are living in fear of an ex-partner who has been released on bail despite a history of violence? The statistics are grim. Domestic violence is one of the leading causes of death for women in the United States. And the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence is when they try to leave. That's when abusers feel their control slipping away. That's when threats become actions. Mâché tried to leave. She reported the violence. She got a protection order. And she was still killed. What does that say about our system? What does that say about our priorities as a society? These aren't easy questions, and they don't have easy answers. But they're questions we need to keep asking, because every time we stop asking them, every time we accept that this is just how things are, someone else becomes a statistic. Kirkland Warren will spend the rest of his life in prison. That's a form of justice. But Mâché Melendez and Leila Stewart are still dead. That's the truth that no sentence can change. This has been the story of Mâché Melendez and her daughter, Leila Stewart. 2 lives cut short in March 2023 in Vancouver, Washington. May they rest in peace. And may their story remind us of the work that still needs to be done to protect victims of domestic violence. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out for help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233. You don't have to face this alone. So if you're still awake, I'd like to know which of tonight's stories gave you chills the most. Was it the first story, the second, or the third? Meanwhile, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. In the shimmering desert heat of Las Vegas, where neon lights compete with the stars and fortunes change with the turn of a card, there lived a woman whose smile could light up the darkest casino floor. Her name was Shauna Tiafe. And if you'd met her, you would have remembered her, not just because of her petite frame and striking looks, but because of something deeper, a warmth, a kindness that made everyone around her feel seen. Shauna was born on March 13th, 1966, in Salt Lake City, Utah. She grew up in a close-knit family, the kind where Sunday dinners mattered, and people actually talked to each other. When she was 12, her family moved to Broomall, Pennsylvania, and later to Northern Virginia. But it was Las Vegas that called to her, the way it calls to so many seeking reinvention, opportunity, or just a fresh start. In 1994, at 28 years old, Shauna packed her life into boxes and headed west to the desert. Las Vegas in the 90s was a city transforming itself. The old mob-run casinos were giving way to corporate mega-resorts, family-friendly facades masking the same ancient promises of luck and escape. Shauna found work as a cocktail waitress, and she was good at it, really good, at the Palms Casino Resort, one of the city's coolest venues. She moved through the gaming floor with practiced grace, balancing trays of drinks, remembering orders, making small talk with high rollers and penny slot players alike. Her colleagues loved her. Her regular customers requested her section. She had that rare gift of making people feel like they were the only person in the room. But being a cocktail waitress in Las Vegas isn't glamorous. Despite what the movies might tell you, the hours are brutal, late nights that blend into early mornings, feet aching in heels, smoke-filled air, and the constant noise of slot machines and drunken laughter. It's hard work, physically and emotionally exhausting. And for Shauna, it was all worth it for one reason. Her daughter Madison. Madison was Shauna's world. Everything she did, every shift she worked, every smile she forced when she was bone-tired, it was all for that little girl. Shauna's friends would tell you that when she talked about Madison, her entire face changed. The weariness would fall away, replaced by pure, uncomplicated joy. Being a mother wasn't just what Shauna did. It was who she was. And then there was George. George Tiafe seemed, on the surface, like exactly the kind of man a single mother might hope to meet. He was a firefighter and EMT for the city of Las Vegas. A position that carried respect and stability. First responders are heroes. After all, the people who run toward danger when everyone else is running away. George had that aura about him, that quiet confidence that comes from knowing you save lives for a living. He was good-looking, charming when he wanted to be, and he pursued Shauna with determination. They married. And for a while it looked like the Las Vegas fairy tale. Two attractive people, both hardworking, building a life together in the suburbs of Summerlin, away from the strip's chaos. On paper, they were the perfect couple. Friends and family who knew them thought they'd found something special. After all, what could go wrong? But behind closed doors, things were different. They always are, aren't they? In the quiet moments away from the public eye, George was not the hero he appeared to be. Friends of Shauna would later describe a man who was controlling, manipulative, verbally abusive. George wanted control of the household, control of the finances, control of Shauna herself. For a woman who'd built a life on her own terms, who'd crossed the country to start fresh, who worked hard and loved fiercely, this must have felt like slowly suffocating. By early 2012, Shauna had enough. She made the difficult decision that so many women before her have made. The decision that takes more courage than people realize. She left. In April, Shauna moved out and got her own apartment, still in Summerlin. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and she was proud of it. A space where she could breathe, where she could be herself, where she could raise Madison without walking on eggshells. But leaving George meant navigating the complicated terrain of shared custody. Madison was 8 years old, caught between two parents, two households, two versions of what had gone wrong. Shauna worked nights at the Palms, her schedule dictated by the casino's needs. George worked long shifts as a firefighter, an EMT, 24 hours on, then time off. Coordinating custody around these schedules wasn't easy, and every exchange, every phone call was a reminder that the marriage had failed. For George, that failure was intolerable. He hadn't just lost a wife, he'd lost control. And there was something else eating at him, too. Money. In a divorce, assets get divided. Child support gets calculated. The comfortable life he'd built was about to be split down the middle, and George couldn't stomach it. His mind began to turn over a dark idea, the kind of idea that most people would dismiss immediately as unthinkable. But George didn't dismiss it. He nurtured it, let it grow, began to plan. He needed someone to do his dirty work, someone expendable, someone the police wouldn't connect to him, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. And one day, while walking his dog, George found exactly what he was looking for. His name was Noel Stevens, though people called him Greyhound. He was 37 years old, homeless, an ex-convict who'd spent time in prison for robbery. Stevens lived on the margins of Las Vegas society, the kind of person tourists step over on their way to the casinos, the kind of person who becomes invisible in a city that only values winners. He was looking for work, any work, willing to do odd jobs for a few dollars. George hired him to do some handyman tasks around the house. They became, in Stevens' mind at least, something like friends. But George was cultivating Stevens for something else entirely. Sometime in early 2012, around the same time Shauna was gathering the courage to leave, George mentioned almost casually an idea. What if someone were to kill his wife? What would that be worth? At first it might have seemed like dark humor, the kind of bitter joke people make when they're angry. But George kept bringing it up. He was serious. He dangled money in front of Stevens. $5,000, he said. For someone living on the streets, $5,000 might as well be $5 million. It was a fortune, a ticket to something better, a way out. They began to plan. This wasn't a crime of passion, a moment of rage that spiraled out of control. This was premeditated, calculated, methodical. Over the weeks and months that followed, Shauna's departure, George and Stevens plotted how it would be done. George bought hammers, 2 of them, purchased at different stores on different days. He bought knives. He made plans. In the month before the murder, George called Stevens 87 times. To put that in perspective, he called Stevens almost as many times as he called Shauna, his estranged wife, the mother of his child. On September 28, 2012, George spoke to Shauna on the phone. It was a brief conversation, just 3 minutes. Probably coordinating something about Madison. Maybe Shauna heard something in his voice. Maybe she did. When George hung up with Shauna, he waited less than a minute. Then he dialed Steven. The next morning, September 29th, was a Saturday. Shauna should have been safe in her apartment, resting after a late shift at the Palms, maybe planning to spend time with Madison. But at some point in those early morning hours, while most of Summerlin slept, Noel Stevens let himself into Shauna's apartment. What happened next was brutal beyond comprehension. Stevens attacked Shauna with a hammer, striking her in the head with savage force. He hit her 17 times. 17 separate blows, using both the claw and the blunt end of the hammer. Each impact shattered bone, destroyed tissue, ended the life of a woman whose greatest joy was being a mother. The attack was so vicious that Shauna's face was left unrecognizable. Her family would later have to hold a closed-casket funeral because there was no way to restore her appearance. Shauna TFA, 46 years old, cocktail waitress, mother, daughter, friend, a woman who'd made people smile for a living, died alone on her apartment floor, murdered by a stranger for $600. Because that's what Stevens ultimately received. Not the $5,000 George had promised. Not the $20,000 that prosecutors would later say George had offered. $600. Less than the cost of a nice dinner in the city where Shauna had worked. George's plan, such as it was, relied on the murder looking like a random break-in. 2 weeks before Shauna's death, there had been an actual break-in at her apartment. Someone had forced their way in, and Shauna had reported it to police. George was counting on investigators connecting the two events, seeing a pattern, a random criminal returning to finish what they'd started. But George had made a critical mistake in his planning. He'd underestimated the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. On the morning Shauna died, George put on a performance. He called 911, his voice strained with what seemed like grief and shock. "I think I need to report a break-in and a murder," he told the dispatcher. My wife is on the floor, bloody, stiff, not moving." When detectives arrived, George repeated his story. He'd come to pick up Madison for his custody time. He'd found the door ajar. He'd walked inside and discovered Shauna's body. He was devastated, he said. He wanted to die, he said. But there was something off about George's demeanor, something that made the detectives take notice. He was too calm in some moments, too emotional in others. The grief not quite landing right, and then there was the truly disturbing detail. George had walked his 8-year-old daughter into that apartment. Prosecutors would later argue that he knew exactly what Madison would see, that he knew Shauna was dead inside, that he deliberately exposed his own child to the sight of her mother's murdered body. Whether he did this for alibi purposes or for some darker reason, we may never fully understand, but Madison saw her mother that day, saw what violence had done to her, and that image is something the little girl will carry for the rest of her life. Detectives began interviewing George at the scene, and immediately he became their prime suspect. Of course he did. In cases where a woman is murdered, investigators always look at the intimate partners first, because statistically that's where the danger comes from. George was separated from Shauna, was facing a divorce that would impact his finances, had access to her apartment, and had discovered the body. Every red flag was waving. But George had been clever. He had an alibi. He'd been at work pulling a 24-hour shift at the fire station. He couldn't have physically committed the murder himself. The timeline didn't work, so if George was involved, he had to have had help. Detectives began pulling phone records, retracing George's movements, looking for connections. And that's when Noel Stevens' name came up. The phone records showed those 87 calls between George and Stevens in the month before the murder. That was highly unusual. Why would a firefighter be calling a homeless handyman that many times? Detectives brought Stevens in for questioning. At first, Stevens denied everything. Sure, he knew George. He'd done some odd jobs for him, but he had nothing to do with any murder. Detectives weren't buying it. They kept pressing, and then they arrested Stevens on an unrelated charge. Possession of a controlled substance with intent to sell. They had him in custody, and they had time to build their case. Meanwhile, George was spiraling. He knew the police were closing in. He knew Stevens was in custody and might talk. In the days after the murder, George tried frantically to reach Stevens by phone, calling him repeatedly, getting no answer. He'd even bought a gun, which prosecutors would later suggest was meant to silence Stevens permanently. But Stevens was already in jail beyond George's reach, and the walls were closing in. On October 11th, 2012, less than 2 weeks after Shauna's murder, George got into his Ford F-250 pickup truck and drove it into a concrete retaining wall at over 80 miles per hour. The crash was catastrophic. George survived, but with serious injuries. Prosecutors would later argue that it was a botched suicide attempt, that George had tried to kill himself rather than face arrest and prosecution. But George didn't die, and the case against him only grew stronger, because by then Stevens had started talking, faced with overwhelming evidence and a murder charge. Stevens admitted everything. He told detectives about the planning, the hammers, the promises of money. He described in horrifying detail how he'd killed Shauna, how many times he'd struck her, what George had told him to do. Stevens agreed to plead guilty and testify against George in exchange for a plea deal. He would admit to first-degree murder, robbery, and conspiracy charges, and in return he would avoid the death penalty. George TFA was arrested and charged with 8 counts, including first-degree murder with a deadly weapon, conspiracy to commit murder, robbery, and burglary. The trial began in August 2015, nearly 3 years after Shauna's death. The prosecution presented a devastating case. They showed the jury surveillance footage of George and Stevens shopping together, buying hammers and knives in the days before the murder. They presented the phone records showing those 87 calls. They put Stevens on the stand, where he testified about the entire plot, describing how George had approached him, how they'd planned it together, how George had promised payment. Stevens told the jury about the night of the murder, how he'd waited for Shauna to be home alone, how he'd carried out the killing exactly as George had instructed. The evidence was circumstantial in some ways. There was no recording of George explicitly ordering the hit, no written contract for murder, but the pieces fit together too perfectly to be coincidence. The hammers, the phone calls, the timing, the money, the attempted suicide, all of it pointed to one inescapable conclusion. George TFA had hired Noel Stevens to kill his estranged wife. George's defense team argued that the prosecution hadn't proven their case. Beyond a reasonable doubt, they put George's sister on the stand as a character witness, painting him as a devoted father and public servant who could never do such a thing. But George himself never testified. His lawyers advised him to remain silent, which was his right. But it also meant the jury never heard his version of events, never saw him deny the charges directly. The trial lasted weeks. Shauna's family sat in the courtroom day after day listening to the details of how she died, seeing the evidence of George's betrayal laid out piece by piece. They'd trusted him once, welcomed him into their family, believed he loved Shauna. Now they understood he'd been planning her death for months. On September 30th, 2015, the jury reached their verdict. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. George TFA sat calmly as the verdict was read, showing no visible emotion, the same flat affect he displayed throughout the trial. On December 1st, 2015, George was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge also sentenced him to additional consecutive sentences for the other charges, ensuring he would never see freedom again. Noel Stevens, who'd cooperated with prosecutors and pleaded guilty, received his own lengthy sentence, though not life without parole. He would be eligible for parole eventually, though whether he'll ever be released is another question. But that wasn't quite the end of the story. In July 2017, 5 years after Shauna's murder, something unexpected happened. George TFA, serving his sentence at Alley State Prison in Nevada, wrote a confession. It was buried inside a 107-page legal appeal, written in all capital letters, a rambling document that attempted to shift blame even as it admitted guilt. George claimed that prescription medications had clouded his judgment, that he hadn't been in his right mind when he planned Shauna's murder. He tried to minimize his responsibility, to explain away the inexplicable, but the confession, such as it was, changed nothing legally. He was already serving life without parole. The confession was perhaps meant for appeals purposes, or perhaps it was simply George's attempt to unburden himself, to put his version of events on record. But for Shauna's family, there was no comfort in it. No confession could bring her back. No explanation could make sense of why a father would plan his wife's murder, and then walk his daughter into the crime scene. Today, George TFA remains in prison, and he will die there. Noel Stevens is also incarcerated, serving his time for the role he played in ending Shauna's life. And Madison, who was 8 years old when she lost her mother in the most traumatic way imaginable, is being raised by Shauna's family. They've tried to give her stability, love, a chance at a normal life despite the horror of what she witnessed and what she lost. Shauna's family created a fundraiser called Shauna's Wish to help support Madison's future. Because that's what Shauna would have wanted. Everything she did, every late night at the Palms, every smile she forced when she was exhausted, was for her daughter, and even in death, even after everything was taken from her, Shauna's love for Madison endures through the family who is ensuring that little girl has the opportunities her mother dreamed of for her. The case of Shauna Tiafe is in many ways a familiar story. A woman leaves an abusive relationship and pays for it with her life. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the period after leaving an abusive partner is the most dangerous time for victims. The loss of control, the threat of financial consequences, the public failure of the relationship. For some abusers, these factors trigger escalation to lethal violence. Shauna did everything right. She left, she got her own place. She was building an independent life, and still her husband found a way to destroy her. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the premeditation, the cold calculation of it all. This wasn't a crime of passion. George had months to change his mind, to see reason, to remember that Shauna was the mother of his child, a human being who deserved to live. Instead, he spent those months planning her death, shopping for murder weapons, grooming a desperate man to do his dirty work, making dozens of phone calls to ensure his plan would succeed. And perhaps the most chilling aspect of all, George was a first responder. He'd taken an oath to protect and serve, to save lives, to run into burning buildings when others ran out. He was supposed to be a hero. Instead, he became a killer, using his knowledge of crime scenes and investigations to try to craft the perfect murder. He understood how police think, how evidence gets collected, how alibis work. He thought he was smarter than the detectives who would investigate his wife's death. He was wrong. In Las Vegas, where Shauna lived and died, the lights still shine. The Palms Casino, where she worked for years, still serves drinks to gamblers, hoping for a lucky break. The apartment in Summerlin, where she died, has likely been rented to someone else by now, someone who may not even know what happened there. Life goes on in the city of second chances, and Shauna's story becomes one of thousands of tragedies that have played out in the desert. But she wasn't just a statistic, just another true crime story. Just another woman killed by a man who claimed to love her. Shauna Tiafe was a daughter, a friend, a cocktail waitress who made people smile. And most importantly, a mother who loved her child more than anything in the world. She deserved to watch Madison grow up, to see her daughter graduate, fall in love, maybe have children of her own. She deserved to grow old, to retire from the casino floor, to spend her later years in peace. She deserved to live. George Tiafe took all of that away. Not in a moment of rage, not in a split-second decision he couldn't take back, but deliberately, methodically, over weeks and months of planning. He took away Madison's mother. He took away a daughter from her parents. He took away a friend from the people who loved her. And for what? Money? Pride? The inability to accept that his wife didn't want to be married to him anymore? There's no answer that makes sense. No explanation that satisfies. Evil rarely makes sense when you look it in the eye. And make no mistake, what George Tiafe did was evil. Not the supernatural kind you see in horror movies, but the human kind, the banal kind. The kind that wears a firefighter's uniform and smiles for family photos and shakes hands with colleagues, all while planning murder in the quiet spaces of its mind. Justice, such as it exists, has been served. George will never be free. Stevens will spend decades, at minimum, behind bars. But justice doesn't resurrect the dead. It doesn't erase trauma. It doesn't give Madison her mother back. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, spare a thought for Shauna Tiafe. Remember her not as a victim, but as a person who lived, who loved, who worked hard and laughed often, and made the world a little brighter for the people around her. Remember that behind every true crime story is a real human being, whose life mattered, whose absence leaves a hole that can never be filled. And if you're someone who's trying to leave a dangerous relationship, know this. Shauna's story doesn't mean you shouldn't leave. It means you should leave carefully, with help, with a safety plan, with people who support you. Call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Tell people what's happening. Document everything. Leave when your abuser isn't home. Change your routines. Get a protective order. Don't go back no matter what they promise. Your life matters. Your safety matters. And there are people who want to help you survive. who want you to have the future that Shauna TFA never got to see. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. On December 22, 2006, just 3 days before Christmas, Gregory drove through the quiet streets of Wayne, Pennsylvania with a heart lighter than it had been in years. His sister Ellen was finally leaving her husband, after decades trapped in what family members described as a suffocating marriage. She had found the courage to say those 4 powerful words. "I don't want to do this anymore." Gary had promised to help. He paid for her divorce attorney, helped her look at apartments, and now he was coming to collect her and his 12-year-old niece, Olivia. They would spend Christmas at his home in Boston, and the next day they would celebrate Ellen's 50th birthday, a milestone she had never expected to reach in happiness, but one that now seemed to herald a new beginning. As he turned onto Forest Road, a tree-canopied lane in the affluent suburb of Upper Merion, Gary felt a rare sense of victory. He had saved his sister. But then he saw them. Police cars. An ambulance. Crime scene tape stretched across the familiar driveway. A patrolman approached. "Who are you?" "I'm the brother of the woman who lives in that house," Gary managed to say. "Your sister is dead." The words hung in the cold, December air. Someone drove him to the police station where a detective asked a question that would echo through the years to come. "Does your brother-in-law own a gun?" Ellen Gregory Rob had been beaten to death in her own kitchen while wrapping Christmas presents. The violence was so extreme that when first responders arrived, they initially believed her head had been torn apart by a shotgun blast at close range. But there was no gun. There was no intruder. There was only her husband, Raphael Rob, a renowned University of Pennsylvania economics professor and expert in game theory, the study of strategic decision-making. And in the days that followed, investigators would discover that Professor Rob had played the most calculating game of his life. Ellen Gregory was born to be a nurturer. The oldest of 3 children, she earned the nickname Little Mother after her father's sudden death when she was just 7 years old. Her father, a financial officer for an American company, had taken the family to live in Colombia, but diabetic shock claimed his life far too soon. The family returned to Pennsylvania, settling in Rosemont, where Ellen became the emotional anchor for her younger brothers, Art and Gary. "Whatever I might have needed," Gary would later recall, "I just remember that Ellen was always there to provide it for me. Food, hugs, Band-Aids. Ellen was there. She worked her way through the College of Textiles and Science, juggling multiple jobs including nannying to support herself. She even sent home her benefit checks from their father's death to help the family. In her early 30s, Ellen was petite, confident, and known throughout her social circle as the person who always knew where the next great party was. She was an extrovert in the purest sense, someone who drew energy from bringing people together. But Ellen had one overriding ambition that defined her adult life. She wanted to be a mother. Raphael Rob was her opposite in nearly every way. Born in Israel in 1950 to Holocaust survivors who never spoke of the horrors they endured, Rob was raised in an atmosphere of silence and stoicism. His father ran a tailoring shop and worked late into the night, pushing his son toward academic excellence as a path out of that life. Rob excelled. He earned a bachelor's degree in economics and mathematics from Hebrew University, Israel's most prestigious institution, before emigrating to the United States. At UCLA, he completed both a master's degree and a PhD in economics. By 1984, he had secured a coveted position at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, where he specialized in game theory. Game theory is, at its essence, the mathematics of strategy. It analyzes human interactions, whether in business negotiations, legal disputes, or even domestic arguments, by modeling each party's options and the associated risks and rewards. A skilled game theorist can think many moves ahead, always positioning themselves for the optimal outcome. Raphael Rob would eventually become one of the world's foremost experts in this field. More than a decade after murdering his wife, his academic standing remains so high that he was ranked in the top 5% of economists worldwide. Ellen met Raphael through a dating service in the late 1980s. At first, she wasn't sure about him. He was so quiet, so different from her warm, outgoing personality. But he had that prestigious position at Penn, and he took her to expensive restaurants in Center City. His work promised visiting professorships abroad, which reminded her of her father, the international businessman. And Raphael seemed to understand what she wanted most. A family. Gregory remembers his first impressions of his future brother-in-law. He had some strange ways about him, but they were easy to dismiss as cultural differences or eccentricities. In old photographs from that era, Raphael cuts an almost blank figure. He's tall and broad-shouldered, but his face seems empty somehow, his features minimal. Even then, he was controlling about money, insisting on maintaining separate finances before and after marriage. At Gregory family gatherings, he would sit quietly, sometimes sweeping tangerine peels and nutshells off the table onto the floor. "Rafe," someone would protest. He'd respond with feigned confusion, leaving the garbage for someone else to clean up. When anyone asked about his work, he offered stiff insults. "It's deep," he would say in his heavily accented English. "I could try to tell you, but you wouldn't understand." Ellen's brother Art, along with aunts and uncles, urged Ellen to reconsider the relationship. "I said to her many times." Art would remember, "Do you really want to be with this person?" But Ellen would simply respond, "I love him." Her family had little choice but to support her decision. They married in 1990. The marriage showed cracks almost immediately. Ellen became pregnant in 1993, and Raphael left her. She lived throughout her pregnancy with her brother Art, who says Raphael showed up late for the birth of their daughter Olivia, and exclaimed, "She couldn't even give me a son." They reconciled, but the damage was done. Raphael and Ellen began sleeping in separate bedrooms. At Raphael's suggestion, Ellen gave up her career to become a stay-at-home mother. His attendance at family gatherings dwindled to almost nothing. Then in 1999, Raphael accepted a visiting professorship in Israel that would take the family abroad for an extended period. When they returned, something had fundamentally changed. Gary's wife, Kim, began overhearing disturbing things during phone conversations with Ellen. He'd call her a stupid piece of shit, Kim recalled. In person, Ellen confessed to Kim that Raphael's emotional abuse had intensified. He would demean her in ways both petty and profound. After she finished cleaning the bathroom, he would undo his pants in front of her and urinate in the sink, a gesture of pure contempt. By 2004, Gary knew his sister was in serious trouble. She began speaking in code during phone calls, rating her tension on a scale of 1 to 10 if Raphael was within earshot. That obviously suggests fear, Gary would later say. The family repeatedly asked Ellen if Raphael was physically abusive, but she always maintained that it was just emotional abuse, just insults. But friends and neighbors were beginning to see signs that troubled them deeply. Neighbor Mary Beth Pedlow had known Ellen since their days together in the Bamberger's department store management training program. She watched as the Rob household transformed. When they returned from Israel, their beautiful home, once a tastefully decorated showplace with artwork collected during international travels, had been trashed by renters. Raphael had been angry enough to keep the security deposit but didn't lift a finger to repair the damage. He didn't lift a finger to put the place back in order. Pedlow remembered. "I think something in Ellen's spirit kind of broke then. The house filled with clutter, boxes upon boxes, many unopened, created narrow pathways through rooms that had once been immaculate. Ellen was developing a hoarding disorder, though no one used that term at the time. What they didn't fully understand then was that hoarding, depression, and obsessive-compulsive disorder are often linked to trauma, particularly domestic abuse. Raphael seemed to advertise his dominance over Ellen in small, cruel ways. He drove new BMWs while Ellen shuttled their daughter around in a beat-up Subaru. The message was clear to everyone who knew them. I have the money, I have the power. Ellen confided in friends like Pedlow that she wanted to leave, but Raphael had made a chilling threat. If she tried to divorce him, he would take Olivia to Israel, and Ellen would never see her daughter again.
Another friend, Luann Dubin, had a daughter named Brooke who was close with Olivia. The girls had been friends for years, but around 2003, the sleepovers at the Rob house began to change. Brooke would call before bed. "Can you come pick me up?"
The house had become uncomfortable. Some nights Brooke heard yelling, fights, dishes breaking. Other times she heard Raphael speaking disparagingly to Olivia about her mother, often telling the 12-year-old that Ellen had no money, as if teaching the girl to view her mother with contempt. There were never any calls to police about domestic disturbances at the Rob home. After her mother's death, Olivia told investigators she never saw violence, but the psychological abuse was relentless and methodical. Then, in October 2006, Ellen attended a high school friend's birthday party, or rather she didn't. She called her old friend Becky Rector to say she couldn't come. She was embarrassed. She had a black eye and her husband had given it to her. Rector pulled over in a parking lot and cried with Ellen for nearly 2 hours. For the first time, Ellen admitted that Raphael had become physically violent. She suspected that his father in Israel had abused his mother, and that his father had never accepted Raphael's marriage to an American Gentile. Being around his father during that long visit had somehow unleashed something darker in Raphael. "You and Olivia can live with me," Rector pleaded. "Don't worry," Ellen said. "My brothers are taking care of me. I'm leaving him." In the fall of 2006, Ellen finally made her decision. During one of their coded phone conversations, she told Gary, "I don't want to do this anymore." Gary seized the moment. "Maybe you should go." Ellen raised the practical concerns that had kept her trapped for so long. Raphael controlled all the money. How would she pay for a divorce attorney without him knowing? How would she support herself and Olivia? "Don't worry about money," Gary told her. "I'll pay for the attorney. I'll get you and Olivia started in a new place." Gary kept his promise. He hired divorce attorney Al Shamtub, who advised Ellen that she could expect about $4,000 a month from Raphael for perhaps as long as 15 years, potentially totaling $600,000. They even found her an apartment, a rental for $1,550 a month where she and Olivia could start fresh. Ellen began shopping differently, buying pots, pans, sheets, towels, all the things you need to furnish a new home. These items added to the clutter in the house, but they represented something Raphael didn't understand. Hope. Friends noticed the change in Ellen immediately. She seemed lighter, happier. She told me she was leaving Rafi with this light in her eyes. Luann Dubin remembered. She wanted Olivia to see there was a better way of living. I was like, Ellen is back. But Ellen didn't know what experts in domestic violence understand all too well. An abused partner is never in more danger than in the window between deciding to leave and getting fully away. That window from the moment the partner says, "I'm leaving," until about a year after they've established their independence, is when they face the greatest risk of violence, even death. Ellen Gregory Rob was squarely in that window on December 22nd. That morning began like many others in the Rob household. Raphael would later claim that he and Ellen argued about holiday plans. She and Olivia were supposed to travel to Boston to spend Christmas with Gary and celebrate Ellen's 50th birthday. According to Raphael, he was concerned they would overstay and Olivia would miss school when classes resumed. What Raphael didn't mention in his initial story was that Ellen had already met with her divorce attorney. The papers were being prepared. His control over her was slipping away, along with a significant portion of his wealth. Olivia left for school. The house was quiet except for the couple and their small dog, Copper, a Shih Tzu who normally had the run of the house. Ellen was in the kitchen, wrapping Christmas presents. The pen she was using to write gift tags was poised in her hand. What happened next would be disputed in the years to come, but the physical evidence told a story of unspeakable violence. Someone struck Ellen Gregory Rob with tremendous force, then struck her again, and again, and again. The weapon, later believed to be a crowbar or chin-up bar, crushed her face so completely that it became concave, creating a bowl that filled with blood. Her features were obliterated. Multiple lacerations cleaved through skin and bone. 2 of her fingers were crushed as she tried desperately to defend herself. The pen she'd been holding snapped in her hand. Blood spattered across the floor, the kitchen cabinets, and even the ceiling. When first responders arrived, they were certain they were looking at a shotgun wound. Nothing else could explain the catastrophic damage to Ellen's head. But forensic pathologist Ian Hood discovered something unexpected when he examined the body. There was no buckshot, no gunpowder residue. The wounds were caused by repeated blunt force trauma with a long, thin object. Someone had beaten Ellen Gregory Rob to death with methodical fury. The killer used far more force than necessary, Hood informed investigators. This was a sign that the killer knew the victim intimately. More than that, the killer hated her. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, Raphael Rob called the local police precinct. Notably, he did not call 911. "I just came home and found my wife murdered on the kitchen floor," he told the dispatcher. "Her head is cracked." That word "cracked" would become one of the most damning pieces of evidence against him. It was a peculiar way to describe what appeared to be a shotgun wound, but it was the exact word that would describe what forensic pathologist Hood would discover. Ellen's skull had been cracked open by repeated blows. When police arrived, Raphael spoke freely. He constructed a timeline for them. He'd last seen Ellen around 8:30 that morning. She was wrapping gifts in the kitchen while Olivia got ready for school. After Olivia left, Raphael ran errands, stopping in Chinatown for fruit, going to a Wawa near Penn for soda, dropping off grades at the university. He said he arrived home around noon. He discovered Ellen on the kitchen floor. He briefly touched her face, realized she was dead, and went upstairs. He left his laptop and briefcase on his bed. Then he heard Copper, their Shih Tzu, barking in Olivia's bedroom. He checked, concerned that Olivia might have come home early from school, but found only the dog. Copper was locked inside the bedroom. Raphael went back downstairs to call the police, but suddenly needed to urinate. He walked down the hall to the bathroom and noticed that the glass in the rear door was shattered. Finally, he called the police. Not 911, but the local precinct. Investigators immediately spotted problems with his story. Parts of his alibi checked out. Surveillance footage showed him drinking an entire soda at the Wawa, and the university confirmed he dropped off grades. But employees at the Chinatown produce store he claimed to visit didn't remember seeing him that day. The timing seemed off. And then there was the supposed break-in. The shattered glass lay in perfect shards on the floor. If an intruder had broken the glass to enter, they would have crushed it underfoot. The break-in was obviously staged. But the most peculiar detail was the dog. Copper, who normally had complete freedom to roam the house, had been locked in Olivia's bedroom. There were no bloody paw prints anywhere in the house. No blood on Copper at all. District Attorney Bruce Castor, who visited the crime scene the day after the murder, understood the significance immediately. In his long career prosecuting homicides, he'd been to many murder scenes involving family pets. They walk in, especially a family pet, right in the blood. Castor would later explain, to check on the master to see what's wrong. Then they track the blood all over the place. The absence of bloody paw prints suggested only two possibilities. Either Raphael had killed his wife in a spontaneous attack, and then, in the aftermath, cleaned himself and secured the dog before it could investigate, or he had planned the murder and locked the dog away beforehand. As detectives David Renick and Drew Marino dug deeper, Raphael's story developed more holes. He claimed the marriage was loveless, but denied that divorce was imminent. Gregory quickly contradicted that claim, explaining that he'd hired his sister's divorce attorney and helped her find an apartment. Raphael acknowledged sleeping in a separate bedroom from Ellen, but portrayed himself as a long-suffering husband dealing with a mentally ill wife. He described Ellen's hoarding, her depression, her obsessive-compulsive tendencies. He painted a picture of himself as a patient, rational man trying to hold together a deteriorating household. But Gary was talking to Ellen's friends and learning a very different story. He was hearing about the emotional abuse, the financial control, the contempt, the black eye. Ellen had shown up with 2 months before her death. I had this sense that the whole thing had been like a puzzle, Gary would remember. And it was like Ellen gave everyone different pieces. And when you put them together, it was so obvious how bad it had been for her. The family asked Gary to wear a wire and try to get Raphael to slip up. Gary agreed, setting his feelings aside. He even hugged his brother-in-law in a hotel parking lot. If I ever had any doubts, they were gone. Gary said, when I put my arms around him, there was no feeling there, and I knew he killed Ellen. Raphael attended Ellen's funeral, the chief suspect milling among the mourners in a cardigan and slacks, not even wearing black. He jumped in among the pallbearers, grabbing a handle of his wife's coffin with one hand while holding a cup of coffee in the other. During the wake, he broke down over the closed casket with what observers described as tearless sobbing. "Oh, Ellen," he shouted. "I can't believe it. What will I do without you?" Everyone watched because, as Gary's wife Kim remembered, there was no emotion in his voice. It was like he understood what he was supposed to do, but he didn't feel it. But Raphael stuck to his story. He never slipped. And without direct physical evidence, no murder weapon, no blood on Raphael or in his car, no trace evidence linking him definitively to the crime, the investigation stalled. Investigators did discover one piece of evidence that was never fully explained in the criminal proceedings. In Raphael's car, they found a full-body protective suit and facial masks, the kind of gear you might wear for hazardous material work. or if you wanted to commit an extraordinarily bloody murder without leaving any trace evidence on yourself. The suit was still wrapped in its packaging, unopened, but its presence raised a disturbing question. Had Raphael purchased multiple suits? Had he used one to kill his wife and kept another wrapped as evidence of an innocent explanation? Raphael would later claim he bought the suit for painting work around the house. But investigators noted that the house was buried in clutter and boxes. Nothing suggested any recent or planned renovation work. On January 8th, 2007, roughly 2 weeks after Ellen's murder, District Attorney Bruce Castor charged Raphael Rob with first-degree and third-degree murder. The affidavit of probable cause laid out a motive and presented facts indicating premeditation. Ellen's divorce attorney confirmed she expected to receive significant alimony, potentially $600,000 over 15 years. She was preparing to leave Raphael and take their daughter with her. For a man who valued control above all else, who had spent years wielding money as a weapon to dominate his wife, this represented an intolerable loss. Money was the motive. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. The staged break-in, the dog locked away, the constantly shifting timeline, the protective suit, the absence of any trace evidence despite the massive amount of blood at the scene. And there were Ellen's defensive wounds, her crushed fingers, the snapped pen in her hand, suggesting she'd fought for her life as her attacker continued to strike her. A first-degree murder conviction in Pennsylvania carried a sentence of life in prison. Under certain circumstances, it could even mean the death penalty. Raphael Rob hired criminal defense attorney Frank DeSimone, and not by accident. DeSimone had defeated Bruce Castor in only one homicide case during Castor's career, the 1994 acquittal of Patty Swinehart, who had been accused of plotting her estranged husband's murder. Castor had been so stung by that loss that he kept a courtroom drawing from the case displayed in his office as a reminder. DeSimone thought an acquittal was possible, but he also understood the risks. A jury trial on first-degree murder charges was a gamble. If they lost, his client would likely die in prison. Bruce Castor had his own concerns about going to trial. The case was circumstantial. There were boot prints in the blood, but experts couldn't definitively match them to Raphael's size 12 shoe, and no boots had been recovered. For all the blood at the scene, there was none on Raphael, none in the house's plumbing, none in his car. In the age of CSI-influenced juries, Castor knew that circumstantial evidence could be a tough sell. In March 2007, Castor approached DeSimone with an offer. If Raphael would plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter, the first-degree and third-degree murder charges would be dropped. Voluntary manslaughter is defined as killing someone in the heat of passion, with serious provocation but without premeditation. The sentence range in Pennsylvania was 5 to 10 years, meaning Raphael could potentially be paroled in as little as 4.5 years. From a game theory perspective, the calculation was straightforward. A first-degree murder conviction meant life in prison, or worse. A manslaughter plea meant a maximum of 10 years, with the possibility of much less. Any rational person weighing cost versus benefits would take the deal. But there was something else Raphael would gain from a plea deal: the opportunity to control the narrative. Without a trial, there would be no extensive cross-examination of witnesses, no detailed presentation of evidence. The official record of what happened to Ellen Gregory Rob would be largely written by her killer. Raphael delayed for months, but ultimately he accepted the deal. On November 26, 2007, he entered his guilty plea. In his plea statement, Raphael told his version of events. He and Ellen argued that morning in the kitchen about the Boston trip. He expressed concern that she and Olivia would overstay, causing their daughter to miss school. The argument escalated. Ellen pushed him. She was 5'4" and overweight. He was 6 feet tall and fit, but according to Raphael, when she pushed him, he fell and struck his head on the counter. "I just lost it," he told the judge. A chin-up bar he had yet to install was lying nearby on the kitchen floor. He grabbed it and started swinging. He couldn't stop himself. The plea deal positioned Ellen as the provocateur, the one who turned a simple disagreement into a physical confrontation. The legal term used was serious provocation, which suggested that Ellen bore some responsibility for her own death. Gary and Art Gregory had mixed feelings about the plea. They believed Raphael had premeditated the murder, but they were also relieved to avoid a trial, and to have Raphael admit at least that he had killed their sister. They still trusted Bruce Castor, the high-profile prosecutor who had won so many cases against powerful defendants. What they didn't realize was that the plea was just the beginning of Raphael's efforts to rewrite history. Raphael's sentencing hearing, held in November 2008, became what Ellen's family would later describe as a second murder scene. This time, an assassination of her character. Raphael's defense team brought in psychologist William Russell, who had never personally examined Ellen, but claimed to have reviewed her medical records and interviewed her husband extensively. Russell testified that Ellen had become severely dysfunctional after Olivia's birth. She suffered from depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and hoarding. She fed Olivia from a bottle until the child was 6 years old, suggesting a deeply unhealthy attachment. According to Russell's testimony, Ellen had spiraled into mental illness while Raphael did his best to hold the household together. He made dinner. He shopped for groceries. He tried to manage his wife's free spending as she accumulated mountains of items they didn't need, cluttering the house with boxes that were never even opened. There are victims all over the place, defense attorney Frank DeSimone told the court. He stated flatly, "This is not a domestic abuse case." Gary and Art Gregory both testified, but they said later that they weren't properly prepared by Castor, the prosecutor who had recently won a race for Montgomery County Commissioner and was juggling his new duties. Didn't prime them on what they could and couldn't say. They angered the judge with missteps, like arguing that their sister's killing had been premeditated, something outside the scope of the manslaughter plea. Most devastatingly, Castor didn't call any of Ellen's friends to testify. Luann Dubin, Mary Beth Pedlow, Sharon Selman, the women who had known Ellen best and could have refuted Russell's characterization, sat in the courtroom, ready to speak. They'd approached Castor multiple times, volunteering their testimony. "Please use us," Pedlow had urged. "We know what happened. I'm the DA," Castor told them. "I know what I'm doing. I'll use you if I need you." He never called them. The women sat there, watching the distorted portrait of their friend go unchallenged. Ellen didn't feed Olivia from a bottle until she was 6 years old. The child ate regular food and carried a bottle of juice to sweeten the taste of medicine she took for a digestive condition. Ellen wasn't an uninvolved mother. She baked cookies for school events, led a brownie troupe, and won Volunteer of the Year at Olivia's elementary school in 2004. And the hoarding? Yes. Ellen had developed a hoarding problem, but her friends understood the context that was never explained to the judge. The clutter had gotten worse in the months before her death, because she'd been buying everything she'd need to furnish a new apartment. Pots, pans, dishes, sheets, towels, lamps. These weren't symptoms of her mental illness. They were evidence of her escape plan. More importantly, research has consistently shown that mental health conditions like depression, OCD, and hoarding are often consequences of abuse, not precursors to violence. As Louise Howard, a professor at King's College Institute of Psychiatry, would explain in a later study, domestic violence can often lead to victims developing mental health problems, and people with mental health problems are more likely to experience domestic violence. But none of this context made it into the court record. Bruce Castor did make the obvious point that mental illness could never excuse murder, and he argued for a 20-year sentence. But Judge Paul Tressler was considering the defense narrative seriously. He seemed inclined toward a sentence on the lower end of the 5 to 10-year range for manslaughter, particularly given Raphael's diagnosis of thyroid cancer. Then Art Gregory produced a letter that would change the judge's calculation. Raphael had been calling Olivia from prison, trying to manipulate his 13-year-old daughter. The letter he sent her was chilling. "Hi, honey. Just to make it easier for you, I am enclosing a self-stamped, self-addressed envelope. All you have to do is print out pictures of you, make a copy of your report card, enclose them in the envelope, and drop it in a mailbox. In return, you will have your holiday gift coming to you in no time. I'd hate to delay sending you the gift, but I won't do so unless I get these items. Remember also that I will be shipped out of the area soon, so if you don't send the items within a day or two, I won't get them for months, if at all. Won't the love of money propel you into action? Love and kisses, Dad." The letter revealed Raphael's fundamental worldview. Everyone was motivated by money. Even his own daughter could be bought. Even affection could be transacted. Judge Tressler rejected Castor's request for 20 years. But citing Raphael's manipulative behavior, sentenced him to 5 to 10 years in prison with 10 years of probation to follow. Raphael Rob would be eligible for parole in 2012. Gary Gregory refused to let his sister's story end, with that sentencing hearing. In early 2007, while Raphael still maintained his innocence, Gary founded a non-profit organization called Every Great Reason, the initials matching his sister's first and middle name, Ellen Gregory. The organization's mission was to raise awareness about domestic abuse and provide resources to people who might be in situations similar to Ellen's. Gary threw himself into the work with the intensity of someone trying to transform tragedy into meaning. "We have to find some way to turn this tragedy into triumph," he had told his wife Kim that awful weekend after Ellen's death. Gary contacted domestic violence experts like Beth Sturman, director of Laurel House, and Maria Macaluso, director of the Women's Center of Montgomery County. When he described Ellen's relationship with Raphael, both women recognized the pattern immediately. They'd seen it hundreds of times. The relationship often begins with generosity and charm. Then comes subtle, controlling behavior. Money becomes a weapon. The abuser demeans their partner's family and friends, establishing dominance. The abuse is usually emotional at first, but then it escalates into physical violence. Half of abused women never know to the hospital or call the police. They feel shame. They blame themselves. Ellen's habit of giving different pieces of information to different people was textbook behavior for someone trying to ask for help while still protecting themselves and their child. It was a muted cry from someone who was still blaming herself for her situation. And the fact that Ellen was killed just weeks after deciding to leave Raphael, that timing was tragically predictable. As Maria Macaluso explained, there is a window from right after the partner says "I'm leaving" until about a year after they've gone, when they face the greatest danger. Raphael Rob had murdered his wife in the deadliest window of domestic violence. To anyone who understood these patterns, Ellen's death was a textbook case. But Gary's most important fight was still ahead. In November 2012, after serving 5 years in prison, Raphael applied for parole under Pennsylvania law. Inmates convicted of violent crimes are eligible for parole after serving the minimum sentence if they demonstrate good behavior and accept responsibility for their crime. Raphael had done both. He'd been a model prisoner. He'd pleaded guilty and expressed remorse. The parole board approved his release. Gary Gregory immediately launched a public campaign. He rallied media attention, organized letter-writing efforts, and enlisted both Bruce Castor and Judge Tressler to weigh in. The judge wrote a detailed letter describing Raphael's manipulative behavior toward his daughter, which had continued from prison. The outpouring was so intense that the parole board did something rare. They rescinded their decision. Raphael Rob would not be released early. Working with State Representative Mike Vereb, Gary helped pass legislation they called Ellen's Law. The new law guaranteed that victims' families could address the parole board before any vote on releasing a violent offender. Since its passage, more than 5,000 survivors have appeared before parole boards in Pennsylvania to tell their stories. Each one represents some victory for Ellen, Gary said. The fight to keep Raphael in prison became an annual ritual. Every year, Raphael would apply for parole. Every year, the Gregory family, now using the law Ellen had inspired, would appear before the parole board to oppose his release. And every year they won. Raphael Rob would serve his full 10-year sentence. But Gary wasn't finished. In 2014, the family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Raphael. They hired renowned civil attorney Robert Mongaluzzi, and the case went to trial that November. The civil trial operated under different rules than a criminal case. The standard of proof was lower, preponderance of evidence rather than beyond reasonable doubt, and Raphael could be compelled to testify. For the first time, Raphael Rob would have to answer questions under oath without the protection of a carefully negotiated plea agreement. The trial was explosive. Olivia, now 20 years old, testified that she had been afraid of her father, contradicting what she'd told police as a 12-year-old girl. She described his violent temper and controlling behavior. But the key witness was Raphael himself. Attorney Bob Mongaluzzi wasted no time establishing the terms of engagement. As soon as Raphael settled into the witness chair, Mongaluzzi advanced. "You're a killer and a liar, Mr. Rob, aren't you?" Raphael paused for only a moment before responding with clinical precision. "Killer, yes. And liar, too, yes." Then Mongaluzzi revealed evidence that had never been presented in criminal court. The protective suit found in Raphael's car. The suit was still wrapped in its packaging, but Mongaluzzi argued that this detail was precisely what made it significant. Perhaps Raphael had owned more than one suit, using one to commit the murder and keeping another wrapped as proof of an innocent explanation. What would an economics professor need with a hazmat suit? Mongalusi didn't ask Raphael about the suit directly. Instead, he asked Raphael to walk through what happened after he killed his wife. The testimony that followed strained credibility to the breaking point. Raphael claimed that after he dropped the murder weapon, creating a massive blood spatter that covered the floor, cabinets, and ceiling, he wandered out to the garage and suddenly realized he was covered in blood. So he returned to the kitchen, standing near his dead wife's body, and stripped off his bloody clothes. He removed his shirt, then his boots, carefully balancing on one leg while standing on the boots to avoid leaving footprints. Then he removed his socks and pants, the same way until he stood naked atop a pile of bloody clothing, surrounded by his wife's blood. He walked upstairs on tiptoe, somehow without dripping any blood on the floor, and went into the bathroom. There he happened to keep a box of large lawn and leaf bags and baby wipes. He used the wipes to clean every trace of blood from his body, placed them inside a leaf bag, got dressed in fresh clothes, and then, still without leaving any trace evidence, carried the bag back downstairs to the murder scene. He somehow re-entered that slaughterhouse in new shoes and clothing, collected the murder weapon and his bloody clothes, and sealed everything in the bag.
Mongalusi methodically destroyed this story. How could Raphael have gone upstairs without any blood from his skin dripping onto the floor?
How could he have stepped back into that blood-soaked kitchen in new shoes and removed evidence without leaving a single trace? And most damningly, if Raphael had actually walked into the garage while still wearing his bloody boots and then returned to the kitchen, why did the boot prints only point in one direction toward the garage? Wouldn't it make more sense, Mongalusi argued, to believe that Raphael had planned everything, that he'd donned a protective suit, murdered his wife, and walked out to the garage where he bagged the suit, the weapon, and his bloody clothes, emerging clean exactly as the hazmat suit was designed to work? The jury didn't need to determine whether Raphael had committed first-degree murder. They only needed to decide whether he was liable for Ellen's death and what damages were appropriate. The verdict was swift and punitive. $124 million. It was a hollow victory. Most of Raphael's assets were tied up in pension and investment funds that are typically protected from civil judgments. The court battles to recover anything for Olivia would drag on for years. But for Gary Gregory, the civil trial accomplished something more important than financial compensation. It established in a court of record that Raphael Rob's story didn't hold up under scrutiny, that his carefully constructed narrative of a man who lost it in a moment of passion couldn't explain the evidence, that he had likely planned his wife's murder, not in a moment of rage, but with cold calculation. In January 2017, after serving his full 10-year sentence, Raphael Rob walked out of prison a free man. He was 66 years old. He settled in a second-floor apartment in a suburb of Pittsburgh, living in conditions remarkably similar to the house he'd shared with Ellen, cluttered, messy, with boxes and papers covering every surface. When a reporter visited him in April 2017, Raphael seemed vital and fit despite his cancer diagnosis years earlier. He spent 20 minutes talking before declaring he wanted the conversation to be off the record. He was considering his options, he explained. There could be a book, a movie, various considerations. He vehemently denied ever hitting Ellen and rejected all claims of emotional abuse from friends and family. He pointed out that Becky Rector never actually saw the bruises. Ellen described, only heard about them over the phone. He claimed the protective suit was for painting work around the house. About other details, his memory suddenly failed. He couldn't remember whether he and Ellen kept separate bank accounts or when exactly he locked the dog in Olivia's bedroom. But what revealed Raphael most clearly was his response to a question about Ellen's brothers. The reporter asked why he thought Gary and Art continued to oppose his parole applications, continued to speak to the media, continued to fight against him year after year. They keep showing up, Raphael said, with evident frustration, going to the media, complaining about me. Why would they still be so angry? What's in it for them? You would think they would move on with their lives. We should all move on with our lives. He even suggested that their efforts to keep him in jail were part of a calculated strategy, that they were building their civil case by posing as mourners when what they really wanted was money. The reporter asked a simple question. Do you ever think that maybe the brothers just hate you because you killed their sister? Raphael paused, considering the question from his game theorist perspective, weighing motivations and outcomes. He said in a high-pitched exhalation, staring into the distance. That could be. They want to cause me pain. But what does that actually accomplish? It is the money. That is the motivation that makes the most sense to me. In that moment, Raphael Rob revealed everything about how he viewed the world. Love, loyalty, grief, justice. These weren't real motivations in his calculations. They didn't fit into his equations. The only variable that made sense to him, the only currency he truly understood, was money. He could never comprehend that Gary and Art Gregory fought for their sister simply because they loved her, because her life mattered, because her story deserved to be told truthfully. Game theory teaches us that every human interaction can be modeled as a strategic game where rational actors pursue optimal outcomes. Raphael Rob spent his career studying these models, analyzing negotiations, teaching students how to think several moves ahead. And in his own life, he seemed to apply those principles with ruthless efficiency. When his wife threatened to leave him, taking half his wealth and his daughter, he eliminated the threat. When investigators came, he staged a burglary and constructed alibis. When he faced first-degree murder charges, he negotiated a plea deal that minimized his prison time and allowed him to control the narrative. When he was sentenced, he expressed remorse and behaved as a model prisoner. He secured early parole consideration, and when that failed, he served his time and emerged. By the cold mathematics of cost-benefit analysis, Raphael Rob achieved a remarkably favorable outcome. He killed his wife, served only 10 years, and retained most of his wealth. His academic reputation, incredibly, remains intact. As of years after the murder, he was still ranked in the top 5% of economists in the world. But game theory, for all its mathematical elegance, fails to account for something fundamental about human existence. It can model transactions, but not meaning. It can predict outcomes, but not understand value. It can calculate costs, but not comprehend the weight of a life. Ellen Gregory Rob was 50 years old when she died. She never got to see her daughter graduate from high school or college. Never got to walk Olivia down the aisle or meet her grandchildren. Never got to experience the freedom she'd been planning, the life she'd been building in her mind, the future that seemed so close she'd already started buying sheets and dishes for her new apartment. Her brothers lost their sister, their little mother, the person who had held their family together after their father died. Olivia lost her mother at 12 years old and grew up knowing her father had killed her. The friends who loved Ellen carry the weight of wondering if they could have done more, said more, understood the danger more clearly. And what did Raphael Rob gain? 10 years of freedom that he's spent living alone in a cluttered apartment, estranged from his daughter, fighting legal battles over money, unable to comprehend why Ellen's brothers won't move on. He won his game, but the prize was isolation and a legacy of horror. In the end, the game theorist miscalculated the most important variable of all. He could plan the murder. He could stage the scene. He could negotiate the plea. But he couldn't calculate the enduring power of love, the permanence of loss, or the way that some truths refuse to stay buried no matter how carefully you construct your narrative. Ellen Gregory Rob's name lives on in a law that helps protect victims. Her story is told and retold as a warning about the lethal danger that lurks in controlling relationships. And her brothers continue to fight, not for money, but for something Raphael Rob's equations could never capture. The simple, immeasurable truth that their sister's life mattered. She mattered more than any outcome, more than any strategy, more than any game. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse, please reach out for help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233, or you can text START to 8878. You are not alone, and there is support available. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.